The Inchcape Rock by Robert Southey, written in England in 1802. No stir in the air, no stir in the sea. The ship was as still as she could be. Her sails from heaven received no motion, her keel was steady in the ocean. Without either sign or sound of their shock, the waves flowed over the Inchcape rock. So little they rose, so little they fell, they did not move the Inchcape bell. The abbot of Aberbrothock had placed that bell on the Inchcape rock. On a buoy in the storm it floated and swung, and over the waves its warning rung. When the rock was hid by the surge's swell, the mariners heard the warning bell, and then they knew the perilous rock, and blessed the abbot of Aberbrothock. The sun in heaven was shining gay. All things were joyful on that day. The seabirds screamed as they wheeled round, and there was joyance in their sound. The buoy of the Inchcape bell was seen, a darker speck on the ocean green. Sir Ralph the rover walked his deck, and he fixed his eye on the darker speck. He felt the cheering power of spring. It made him whistle, it made him sing. His heart was mirthful to excess, but the rover's mirth was wickedness. His eye was on the Inchcape float. Quoth he, "My men, put out the boat, and row me to the Inchcape rock, and I'll plague the abbot of Aberbrothock." The boat is lowered, the boatmen go, and to the Inchcape rock they go. Sir Ralph bent over from the boat, and he cut the bell from the Inchcape float. Down sunk the bell with a gurgling sound. The bubbles rose and burst around. Quoth Sir Ralph, "The next who comes to the rock won't bless the abbot of Aberbrothock." Sir Ralph the rover sailed away. He scoured the seas for many a day, and now, grown rich with plundered store, he steers his course for Scotland's shore. So thick a haze o'erspreads the sky, they cannot see the sun on high. The wind hath blown a gale all day, and evening it hath died away. On the deck the rover takes his stand. So dark it is, they see no land. Quoth Sir Ralph, "It will be lighter soon, for there is the dawn of the rising moon." "Canst hear," said one, "the breakers roar? For methinks we should be near the shore. Now where we are I cannot tell, but I wish I could hear the Inchcape bell." They hear no sound. The swell is strong. Though the wind hath fallen, they drift along, till the vessel strikes with a shivering rock. "O Christ, it is the Inchcape rock!" Sir Ralph the rover tore his hair. He cursed himself in his despair. The waves rush in on every side. The ship is sinking beneath the tide. But even in his dying fear, one dreadful sound could the rover hear. A sound as if, with the Inchcape bell, the devil below was ringing his knell.
We left the town of Audiobook and sailed out on the sea. The wind blew from the east that day, it proved cold company. The Inchcape Reef was our plain name, where many lives were lost. Countless ships had hit the rock at a dreadful human cost. A means to mark this deadly reef was the purpose of our trip. To rob the rock of its terrible toll, and to warn of its grisly grip. A beacon built for all to to sea, steering sailors from the rock, helping them to survive the seas and come safely home to dock. We landed on that dangerous reef and mapped its sea-carved face, and next decided on the spot a lighthouse best to place. Then through the kinder summer months of 1807, we laboured on the Inchcape reef to make foundations even. For 3 more years we laboured hard, the tower grew towards the sky, reaching closer to our goal that no more men may die. And so on the 1st of February in the year of 1811, the Bellrock Lighthouse beamed its light, flashing strong and even. 5 brave men lost their lives while working on the bell. 2 masons, Lind and Walker, died in conditions close to hell. James Scott, John Shaw, 2 sailors were both taken by the sea. And the smith called Charlie Henderson, they live on in memory. Today, no further lives are lost. The lighthouse sends a warning that this is where the Inchcape reef sets the seas a-stormin'. Sailors praise the blessed beam that shines out in the night, and give thanks to Robert Stevenson, who built the Bellrock Light. And give thanks to Robert Stevenson, who built the Bellrock Light.
Chapter 1. Press Ganged. Jamie's father slammed the door, and his footsteps receded down the lane. There was a long, terrible silence, but then his mother spoke quietly. "He'll be back, Jamie, but keep out of his way. You know what he's like with a drink inside him and a bottle in his hand." Jamie knew she was weeping by the way her shoulder threw a humpy shadow across the wall. She always humped her shoulders when she tried to hide her face. Suddenly, the sound of an infant's crying came from the next room, and glad of the excuse to do something, she took the candlestick with her and disappeared. Jamie heard her crooning softly, and soon the crying stopped. Meanwhile, he sat by the fire, whittling on a piece of driftwood with a tiny knife. It was his only really private possession, and he could whittle beautifully. Every chip of wood flew straight into the flames, stirring up sparks which danced for a moment and died again. "Maybe I'll have to carry him home again," he said when his mother returned, and she smiled. "You're a fine big lad for 12 years, and you've a grand pair of strong shoulders on you, but there's times when even Andrew Thompson the butcher couldn't carry your father home. When he's in one of his tempers, it's best just to let him find his own way back in his own good time." Jamie whittled on, and the cinders did a jig in the grate. He was carving a boat, for in the fishing town of Arbroath, the thoughts of most young boys turned almost by instinct to the sea. Every evening the fishermen came to land their creels at the harbour, and there was hardly a day when Jamie Scott was not down at the pier watching wistfully as the boats sailed off again into the North Sea. This was not approved of by the town's schoolmaster, however, for every day Jamie would arrive late at the schoolhouse, breathless from the run, and always with the same excuse. And every day the dominie would solemnly take out the leather strap from its resting place in his huge gnarled desk and administer 4 terrible blows on Jamie's hand. "Perhaps the taws will teach you punctuality," he would roar as the belt bit his hand yet again. Jamie was not really a bad boy, but part of his nature hated being told what to do. He much preferred whittling boats, or guddling for fish, or watching the fishermen at work, for these were things without rules, and he could start or stop as he pleased. He was also big and strong for his age, with a mop of curly black hair which sometimes made him look older than he was. People used to tease him, saying that with muscles like his, he should be out of the school and helping his father with the weaving loom which stood in the back room of their house. But Jamie would just laugh it off. "No fear. If I don't learn this numbers and writing business, I'll never escape the dominie's clutches." Though in truth, it was the thought of working with his father at the loom which terrified him even more than the schoolmaster. Almost everything about his father terrified him, from the great barrel of his body and the wild straggles of his hair to the hoarse rasp of every word he spoke, for there was not a moment when he was not either blind drunk or staggering through the miseries of a throbbing hangover. Either way, he was usually in a foul mood, and as the oldest of the 5 children, Jamie took the brunt of his bullying. William and Charlie were so young that even in his drunken rages his father seemed to understand that he could not attack them. Mary and Catherine, being little girls, had learned to amuse him with their happy laughter, and for some unclear reason this seemed to entertain him. But Jamie was a big, strong boy, and though he had long since learned never to provoke his father, he seemed always to do something to trigger off another temper. By now his father's drinking had become notorious, even in a fishing port like Arbroath, for the family owed money to almost every shopkeeper and tradesman in the town. Of course, there were many other drinking men in the place, for life as a handloom weaver in 1808 was very bad now that so many mills were robbing them of a living. But none seemed to spend so many of their meagre shillings drowning their worries in whisky. Not that anyone dared mention this to Jamie's father, for he could be a fearsome man when he was full. Often he would work the shuttle like a red-hot piece of coal, as though he hated it, making it fly backwards and forwards across the loom as if it burned his hand. But then he would suddenly subside as though he had lost all heart for the work, and with a gruff excuse he would search his pockets for money. Then the door would slam, the children would waken, and his mother would cry. It was like that most evenings. Jamie finished carving the hull of his boat and placed it carefully on the mantelpiece above the fire. Then he pulled back the curtains of his box bed and climbed in. Outside the window it was night, and the moon shone strong and pale. There were no clouds, and it would soon be cold, for the wind was rising. Jamie pulled a blanket round him, and across the room the candle went out. "Good night, Mother," he called in the darkness. "Don't worry, I'll keep out of his way." He couldn't hear if she was still crying. And then Jamie fell asleep. He was woken by a tremendous hammering on the door, who knows how long after. "Mistress Scott, wake up!" Jamie recognised the voice of John Henderson, a neighbouring weaver. He was quickly alert, but already his mother was shuffling in the dark towards the door, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. "Oh, what's wrong?" she grumbled. "Has he fallen in the harbour again?" She opened the door a fraction to find John Henderson's face worried in the moonlight. "No, it's much worse this time. The press gang is here, in Arbroath. I think they've got your husband." And in a minute, Jamie was out of the door and running with bare feet down the cobblestones of the lane, past the gloomy ruins of Aberbrothick Abbey, and down into the harbour area of the town where his father liked to drink. He was panting hard when he reached the pub and burst into its warm, smelly atmosphere, but the sailors and workmen there just laughed when he asked of his father. "Last we saw of him, he was lying outside, full as a lord and singing to the stars," grinned one man. Panic jumped in Jamie's chest, and he ran out into the cold again, searching all the local streets and alleys for the familiar sight of his father's great lumpy body lying in a corner somewhere. He tried other pubs, a small boy tugging at sleeves and coughing in the strong pipe smoke, but his father was not there. Deep inside him, Jamie already knew that his search was hopeless, for if there was a press gang in town, they would hardly have missed the prize of his half-witted father lying so conveniently in a drunken stupor outside in the street. At last he stopped his wanderings and ran down to the harbour. Sure enough, there was the sinister outline of a warship lying offshore, clear as anything in the moonlight. Was his father already on board? He ran on to the end of the pier, and then suddenly, there below him was a longboat pulling steadily out to the distant ship. There were sailors heaving on the oars, and from the hat he wore, there seemed to be an officer sitting at the stern. And there were others, lifeless lumps huddled down in the middle of the boat. "Father!" shouted Jamie, and one of the dim bodies stirred and groaned. Jamie was certain now. "Father! Father!" he shouted again and again. But the boat moved on steadily into the gloom, until all he could see was the moonlight glittering as the oars splashed through the water. "Father!" he called miserably. But he was alone among the creels at the end of the pier, and his voice seemed only to echo mockingly round the bleak ruins of the abbey high behind him. Then a chill shivered through him, and with tears welling for the father he had feared, Jamie turned for home. The days crawled by, and Jamie's mother fretted terribly, for no one knew when her husband might return from the navy, if he ever did. One woman in Arbroath had already lost her husband, killed in the great sea victory at Trafalgar by a shattered mast which crushed him as it fell. It was a sharp reminder that Britain's war with France and Napoleon could reach into any family. But much worse than the fate of her good-for-nothing husband was the hopeless worry of how Jamie's mother was to look after her 5 children, for William and Charlie seemed to cry constantly for food. She already had such heavy debts with the Arbroath shopkeepers that, although they all wrung their hands and sympathised with her difficulties, none would give her more credit without knowing when they would be paid. For a time, Jamie found work after school, sweeping out the sawdust from the floors of the pubs down by the harbour, but one day he worked there all morning too, and received a terrible lecture from the schoolmaster. "That you should be working in a place like that!" he roared, as the leather belt was taken from his desk. "You'll soon be on the same road to ruin as your father!" The belt smacked downwards, and the dominie's voice bellowed as if it was all to save Jamie's soul from the horrors of some terrible sin. "And you not even able to write or read yet, Jamie Scott! Is that not a fine opinion of education?" And the belt came down again. Jamie returned home to find his mother staring into the fire with empty eyes. She smiled as he came in, but he could see at once that something was wrong. "I tried your father's loom today," she said eventually, "but it's sore work for a woman." She smiled ruefully in the firelight. "You should feel my back. It's like a broken stick." Then I showed the cloth to John Henderson, and he showed me all the mistakes. "I'll never sell cloth like that nowadays," he said, "not with the mill making it twice as fast as I can, and with no knots." She turned her back to him again, and Jamie knew his mother was weeping with despair. The next day, he was down at the harbour early, for he had made a decision. He would leave the school and find better work, even if he couldn't read or write. Illiteracy was no handicap for a fisherman, he reasoned, for it was a trade learned by experience, not from books. Jamie started off towards the pierhead. There was certainly plenty of activity on the pier, but there was no work for him on the fishing boats. The season was almost over, they said, and the men would soon be back to spend the winter making ropes and sails and mending their nets. They would not even let him unload the creels, for this was women's work. The fisherwomen would fill the baskets full of herring and carry them on their backs sometimes many miles to their destinations. But Jamie was not allowed to join them. Even baiting the lines was done by girls, and he soon became more and more despondent. Everywhere it was the same. The season was nearly over, the work was done by women, he was too young to do a man's work. But then Jamie realised the real reason for his lack of success. These fisher folk were a special people, tight-knit and secretive and loyal to their own kind. But his father was a flax weaver, and so Jamie could never belong to the fishing folk. There would never be work for him down at the pier head. His spirits fell further now, for he had wasted the whole morning, and he didn't dare return to another confrontation with the schoolmaster. Then, suddenly, Jamie had the answer. Of course! There in front of him was the lighthouse supply boat loading up with timber and barrels. The lighthouse boat! Everyone in Arbroath knew about the lighthouse. There had not been a topic of conversation like it for years, for it was all so daft. For years, the town's boatmen had made a living on the side by collecting coins and buckles and such trophies from the terrible Bell Rock, a notorious underwater reef 11 miles out into the North Sea, which had trapped many an unwary trading vessel on its ugly black teeth. It was well known as a ship's graveyard, for only when the tide was well out did even the tip of the sinister rock show itself. Now, someone had decided to build a lighthouse there, much to the great amusement of Arbroath. For as every philosopher in the place could tell you, how could a tower be built on an underwater rock? How would the cement hold? Where would the workmen live so far out to sea? No wonder the lighthouse was the laughing-stock of the town. And yet, Arbroath had undoubtedly become a busy place these days. Wagons carrying huge blocks of stone trundled through the streets every day towards a new workyard which had suddenly sprung up full of cranes and sheds and noise. An army of strangers had undoubtedly invaded the town too, for the place was full of masons and joiners and other workmen seeking accommodation in local houses. Boats were toing and froing from the harbour like bees around a hive, bringing in huge blocks of stone from Aberdeen and Perth, fetching food and beer and letters for the men working mysteriously out at sea somewhere, sailing off with endless cargoes of timber and tools for this impossible workplace just over the horizon from Arbroath. There had to be work for him somewhere amongst all this buzzing activity, Jamie decided. That night he told his mother of his plan, talking softly to her in the dark from the recess of his box bed, and hoping she would not feel the strange mixture of excitement and nervousness thumping in his chest. She protested, of course, and Jamie kept silent when she did, but when she woke up in the morning, he was already gone. On the table she found a few copper coins, all that was left of Jamie's odd jobbing round the town, but through her sobbing tears she was happy. Jamie was not going to be like his feckless father. Chapter 2. The Smeaton. Jamie put on a casual manner, but with his heart thumping away like a recruiting sergeant's drum, and wandered along the quay towards the lighthouse vessel. Soon he was seated on a bollard watching the sailors working below him in the boat. After a time, a plan began to form in his mind, and soon even his confidence returned. "Why is this boat called the Smeaton?" he inquired, as a man down in the hold looked up. "Why, laddie," he smiled, "John Smeaton was the man who built the famous Eddystone lighthouse. Have you ever heard of it?" "No," said Jamie, "but I've heard they're building a lighthouse on the Bell Rock," he added innocently. "Aye, laddie, and this is the boat which carries the stones for that light." Jamie pretended not to have known, and eagerly questioned the man further, for he was curious to learn anything of the way of life he was planning to join. "That must be exciting work, all that working far out to sea," he called down to the man in the hold. "Not really, laddie. Not unless you like the salt spray whipping your face and muscles aching in places you never knew you had. But it pays a good wage and keeps my family alive." Jamie tingled when he heard this, and for a moment he had a picture in his mind of his mother and brothers and sisters. Somehow or other, he would find a way to keep them alive too. Just then, a wagon came rumbling along the quay, and Jamie watched as 24 large barrels were carefully loaded into the hold. "What's in the casks?" he asked, and the man looked up again. "What do you have all around you out at sea but you can't use?" Jamie smiled. "Why, water, of course. That must be drinking water for the men, then, is it?" "That's right, laddie. You can quarry all the stones you like and send them out to Bell Rock every day if you want, but without fresh drinking water, all the stones and cement and strong men in the world will never build the lighthouse. So this time, we're taking out water." "What else are you taking?" asked Jamie. The man looked up again and wiped a sweaty hand across his brow with a big grin. "You're certainly an inquisitive laddie, aren't you? Well now, let's see." The man looked around the hold. "Why not come down here and have a look?" The plan was working, but trying not to show it, Jamie clambered down a ladder and was soon standing among the water barrels which had just been loaded on board. By now, the sailor was busy explaining things to him, ropes and battens and tools and so on, but it was just a noise in the background, for although Jamie nodded from time to time, his mind was racing elsewhere, searching for somewhere to stow away. Then, in the gloom, he noticed a tarpaulin lying in a dark corner. That would be his hiding place. Meanwhile, the voice was still talking. "And then there's the gunpowder, that's in the small kegs over there. Now, laddie, is there anything more I can tell you?" The man gave a friendly smile, and Jamie snapped out of his private thoughts. "Yes," he said. "When do you sail?" hoping his voice sounded casual. "Oh, we'll be off on the tide in about an hour if this wind holds." The sailor was following Jamie back up the ladder to the quayside. "Meanwhile, I'm off for some breakfast." On the quay, the man turned and smiled. "You can look after the smeaton if you like. Just you have a seat on your bollard, and when the rest of the crew arrive, you tell them Jack Lamont asked you to keep an eye on their boat. And if you see them first, you tell them Jamie Scott's on guard," called Jamie, hardly daring to believe his luck as the man went off. He watched the man Lamont disappear into a tavern, and then quickly descended the ladder and crawled under cover. The canvas was old and rotten and smelled of salt and seaweed, but what did that matter at a time like this? In the darkness, a rat scuttled over his covering, and Jamie gave a frightened start, but just then he heard voices drifting down from the quayside. "Oh, that's strange. He seemed happy to wait here on guard, and he knew we had powder kegs on board. It was Jack Lamont." "Probably got fed up," said a voice right beside Jamie, and he almost jumped with fright, for he had not heard anyone coming down into the hold. "Anyway, everything seems to be here, so let's get under way." There was a loud scraping and thumping, which Jamie supposed were the hatches being battened down, and then a more distant creaking of ropes and shouting of orders. Soon he felt movement, which grew presently into a full swell as the Smeaton moved out into the open sea beyond the harbour. Cautiously, he pulled back a little of the cover, but the hold was pitch black, and he decided that no one was in there with him. So he crawled out, and sat on top of the tarpaulin with his knees pulled up under his chin. He was not at all frightened, but occasionally he shivered a little in the darkness, and presently he grew hungry. Mostly he sat there thinking, was it too late to go home now? But what did the future hold in store for him? Eventually, after what seemed a long time, Jamie suddenly heard more shouting of orders and the sound of feet on the deck above him, and he crept back under the tarpaulin. Even through the thick timber of the ship's hull, he could hear a tremendous dashing of surf on rocks, the Bell Rock. Soon the hatches were open again, and men were down in the hold. Jamie could hear the water barrels and powder kegs being rolled about and hoisted out onto the rock. Then quite suddenly his tarpaulin was whisked off, and there stood an enormous seaman looking quite amazed. The only things which Jamie could see in the gloom were a ghastly twisted mouth and a hideous scar down one cheek, and he instantly decided that he didn't like this man at all. For a moment the two stared at each other, Jamie with this vision of the scar filling all of his mind, but then before he had a chance to escape, a huge pair of hands clamped onto his collar and pulled him to his feet. "What have we here, then?" The man's breath stank of drink, but much worse. The voice was exactly that of Jamie's father. In a panic, Jamie struggled to free himself, but the hands were like giant hams and powerful like a blacksmith. "Not only a stowaway, but violent too, eh?" The voice terrified Jamie, but the man just grinned horribly at his puny effort to wriggle free. "We'll see what Captain Mitchell has to say about you. I reckon the Navy could use a lad like you." And before Jamie could find the courage to utter a word to this fearsome man, he was dragged off up the ladder and out of the hold. A door was thrown open, and he was pushed into some sort of cabin. Then it slammed shut again, and the key turned. "Just you cool off in there," growled the seaman from outside. "Captain Mitchell doesn't like stowaways." And the man's footsteps receded. Jamie sank to the floor with relief, his heart still pounding away like a washerwoman cleaning in a burn. But the man had gone, and for the moment he was not in danger. Gradually his panic subsided, and Jamie started to think. The very thought of the man sent shivers through him, but what frightened him most was the uncanny resemblance to his father's voice. But then there was more. What had the man meant when he said the Navy could use a lad like him? Was he to be given, perhaps even sold by this Captain Mitchell to the Navy? The very idea sent his heart fluttering again. For how would he be able to help his family then? And then there was this Mitchell himself. What did he do with stowaways whom he didn't like? Did he perhaps beat them, or even throw them overboard? Fearful thoughts flooded through his mind, dragging his spirit down into a despondent gloom. Finally, Jamie decided there was only one thing to do. He must escape. There was a window which opened, and there below was the sea, gushing and swirling among the crags of the Bell Rock, a short distance away. For a moment, Jamie studied the eddying, rushing white foam, and then he jumped. For an instant, he plunged into the sea, feeling the wetness and the cold. But then there was a tremendous bang and a shower of stars in his mind. Everything went black. When he awoke, he was lying on the rocks with a ring of faces staring down at him. Everything was blurred and groggy, but he could hear voices. "Who is he? Where did he come from? Does anyone know him?" And then a voice which he knew, his father's voice. "That's him, Captain. That's the boy I told you of." The blur began to clear, and among the circle of curious faces above him, Jamie saw the scar and the twisted mouth. His heart sank. "Stand up, boy," barked another voice. "Stand up if you know what's good for you." This new voice wore a captain's cap, and even in his daze, Jamie remembered Scarface talking of the man Mitchell. Jamie struggled to his knees, and then a helping hand caught him under the armpit and pulled him to his feet. "Try to stand, Jamie Scott," urged a familiar voice quietly in his ear. It was Jack Lamont. Everything was so bewildering, but Jamie stood and turned to the captain. Suddenly the man swung a fist and smacked Jamie hard across the face. "That's what I think of stowaways," he snarled. Anger blazed in Jamie's eyes, and he started forward, but again Jack Lamont caught his arm. "No, Jamie," he urged, just as someone else pushed through the crowd. "What's going on here? Why are you men not at work?" There was authority in the voice, and immediately the men dispersed. Even Scarface slouched off, and with a reassuring look Jack Lamont left too. "That's Mr. Stevenson," he whispered as he went. But there was no time to add more, and Jamie had no idea who this Mr. Stevenson might be. He was not tall, and though not old either, he had rather kindly grey eyes and receding brown hair tousled by the wind. But he had the air of a gentleman, perhaps an educated man, and from his manner he was obviously in charge. "Who is this boy, Captain Mitchell?" demanded Mr. Stevenson. "He's a stowaway, sir. We found him on board the Smeaton, but he must have escaped, for the next thing we knew he was lying here on the rocks unconscious." Even the captain was speaking respectfully to Mr. Stevenson, Jamie noticed. Then Mitchell turned. "I've a good mind to have you whipped, boy," he growled, but Mr. Stevenson caught his arm and intervened. "That shouldn't be necessary, Mr. Mitchell. The lad seems to have pluck. Perhaps we can find work for him." "Follow me, boy." And Jamie followed, thankful to have escaped Captain Mitchell. Mr. Stevenson led him across the Bell Rock, and as he stumbled and slithered across the slimy sandstone rocks and seaweed, Jamie had a look at his new surroundings. It certainly was a bleak place, just a rugged but flattish reef, circled by a green sea which spurted up through gullies and fissures all around with a sudden white rushing froth. Here and there it surged into some rocky cleft, to gurgle and rumble for a moment before exploding in a shower of spray, which sometimes even reached Jamie. Just beyond the rocks, the Smeaton lay at anchor, her cargo now being transferred by some longboats to the rock herself, where the water casks were already being carried off by a number of workmen. Indeed, the entire rock seemed to be alive with men, most of them dressed in tatty red-stained work clothes. A number were busy with pickaxes, chipping away a large circular hole near the centre of the rock. Perhaps this was where the lighthouse was to be built, thought Jamie, for he had never seen a lighthouse before. Nearby, more men seemed to be standing in line beside an anvil where a blacksmith was sharpening their tools with a loud clanking, which could be heard all over the rock above the ceaseless dashing of the sea. The smith even had a fire, which he pumped vigorously with a pair of bellows from time to time, urging on the embers with terrible curses when they would not glow. It was a fascinating but frightening place, this Bell Rock. Most curious of all, however, was the strange building towards which he was following Mr. Stevenson. Indeed, were it not for a chimney and several windows, Jamie would not even have known it was a building at all, for it was not like anything he had ever seen before. It stood on a sort of pyramid of legs, formed out of 6 huge thick timbers driven into the ground and fastened together by interlacing struts. The house itself was like a giant wooden drum with a pointed roof, built high upon the pyramid of legs. There was a door, which was reached by climbing a rope ladder fastened to one of the 6 legs, and from where a black mongrel dog stood watching the scene of activity below. Mr. Stevenson started up the ladder, and still Jamie followed. By now, curiosity and wonder had replaced his fear, and he was longing to ask all sorts of questions. But he decided to see first what sort of man this Mr. Stevenson was like. "Is that dog of yours still not going to leave us, Archie?" called Mr. Stevenson as he reached the door high above the rock. "That he is not, sir, and I'll not be leaving either," said a voice from within, both respectful but firm in tone. Mr. Stevenson laughed heartily. "Goodness knows what I'm going to do with you, Archie. How can I find you work if you won't come down from the house?" Mr. Stevenson disappeared inside. "Just you find me work to do in here, and me and Rab will be just fine," said the voice again. And as Jamie clambered into the house, he found himself facing Auld Archie. There was something at once endearing yet frightening about him. He had a face worn rugged and lined by age and weather, and a straggling grey beard filthy with grease and dirt, from which protruded a stumpy clay pipe. The eyes were sunk deep under bushy brows, and yet they seemed to see everything. The hands were worn and calloused, and he had only one leg. How on earth had he arrived here with only one leg, wondered Jamie. But just then Mr. Stevenson set off up a ladder through a trapdoor into an upper compartment, and he hastily followed, watched with no surprise at all by old Archie and the black dog Rab. This room seemed to be unfinished, for tools and wooden planks and canvas lay everywhere. But Mr. Stevenson pressed on up another ladder, and presently Jamie found himself in the third room. Here there were papers and plans laying spread out on the floor, and Mr. Stevenson said, "Be careful, boy," which rather relieved Jamie, for he had said nothing so far except, "Follow me, boy," followed by an ominous silence. For a long time Mr. Stevenson stared out of a window, perhaps watching the workmen far below. But presently he turned to Jamie. "What is your name, boy?" he asked, like a stern but yet friendly schoolmaster. "And how old are you? Where do you come from?" Jamie told his story, and Mr. Stevenson listened quietly, high up in the curious house, while the blacksmith's hammer rang out below. He nodded when told of the press gang which had taken his father, as if he knew all about it, and then frowned slightly when Jamie told how he had decided not to return to school. Then he smiled when Jamie explained how he had wheedled his way onto the Smeaton and how a rat had run over him in the dark. "You'll not want to be afraid of the rats if you're going to work in a boat," he said, almost as though offering advice. And Jamie felt that perhaps this Mr. Stevenson was not too angry with him after all. Then he went on about how he had been discovered and had then escaped. When it was all over, there was a long silence while Mr. Stevenson studied Jamie closely. But there was something in the gentleman's gaze which gave Jamie hope, and he looked back unflinchingly. "Well, you're a fine strapping lad for 12, he seemed to murmur to himself, "and you've a grand spirit in your heart." Then he took a piece of paper and jotted down a letter with his quill. When he was finished, he turned again to Jamie. "You see, Jamie Scott," he said suddenly, "I am the father of children myself." He seemed to drift off into a lonely world for a moment, as if thinking of them at home. "My daughter Janet died last winter," he added quietly. "And then Thomas and Elizabeth, so happy and innocent, in June. So you see, Jamie, I have also known misfortune." He paused, lost in sadness for a moment. But then he came to Jamie and held him at arm's length by the shoulders. "I sometimes wonder who would look after my wife and children should I be taken in some tragedy here on the Bell Rock. You are a fine boy to be thinking of your mother. Perhaps my own sons will grow up to be like you." Jamie said nothing, for Mr. Stevenson seemed to be talking as much to himself as to the boy he still held at arm's length. But inside he knew that he liked this man. He was firm and strong, but he understood and was kind. Suddenly, Mr. Stevenson seemed to return from his private thoughts. He let Jamie go, and in a more businesslike manner picked up the letter. "This will give you work, Jamie," he said. "You will receive beef, bread, oatmeal, butter, barley, vegetables, and beer. Do you like beer?" And Jamie nodded vigorously for fear of spoiling his luck. "You will also have free accommodation, and you will be paid 10 shillings each week, which I shall send to your mother every month until, God willing, your father returns from the Navy." A surge of relief and gratitude swept through Jamie, and he began to sob. Now, Jamie Scott," commanded Mr. Stevenson with mock sternness. "Grown men should not cry, and seamen certainly don't." He did not approach the boy, but he gave him a friendly smile. "Now, you just take this letter to Captain Mitchell. You will begin work today," he ended, almost formally, as if wearing his master's hat again, and then turned away to his documents. Captain Mitchell? Of all the work on the Bell Rock where there seemed to be so many jobs, it had to be on board the Smeaton. Jamie felt an overwhelming panic, but by now Mr. Stevenson was busy reading papers, and without another word, Jamie climbed back down the ladder to the lower compartments. "Aye, laddie, he's a fine man, is Mr. Stevenson," said Auld Archie, but Jamie said nothing. "Never you mind," added the old man, as if reading the boy's mind. "You'll be back, and one day you and I will be friends." But Jamie just climbed on down the ladder and crossed the Bell Rock towards the Smeaton. Chapter 3. Scarface. A longboat dropped him off by the Smeaton, and Jamie clambered on board. Sure enough, there was Captain Mitchell waiting. "So you're back, eh, boy?" he growled. Jamie decided silence was best and handed over the letter. "You'll sleep in the hold, boy," the captain grunted when he had finished reading. "You seem to like it down there," he added sarcastically. "And when you work under my command, you work hard, boy, for I'll have no passengers on the Smeaton. You hear, boy? Mr. Stevenson doesn't like wasters on the Smeaton. We've a job to do. There's a lighthouse to build. You understand, boy?" Jamie nodded, and Captain Mitchell turned about and left. Jamie stood alone on the deck. "Well now, you've a story to tell, haven't you, Jamie Scott?" It was Jack Lamont calling to him from down in the hold, and Jamie quickly scrambled down into the dark. "Here, have some food. You must be starving." Jamie gratefully took a large biscuit and started eating, but it was cement hard and he threw it away in disgust. It was not a funny joke. "Hey, that's good seaman's food you're throwing away," protested Jack Lamont. "Time was when all sailors lived on nothing but hard tack, bully beef and grog. Never could stand the beef, but I always liked the biscuits. The maggots give them taste, you know." He grinned. "Here, I'll show you." And he tapped the biscuit hard on the deck. 2 small weevils dropped out. "See? They give it flavour." Jamie grimaced in the gloom, and Jack Lamont laughed. "No, Jamie Scott, don't worry. You've got a friend on board the Smeaton. I like a shipmate with curiosity. I reckon you can teach me a thing or two, and I'll be learning you a few points too. Never too young or too old to learn, I always say. Now, you call me Jack, and we'll get along just fine." He held out a grimy hand in the gloom, and the two shook hands. They would be friends. "Are we really going to have biscuits?" asked Jamie after a time, for he was becoming really very hungry. Jack Lamont laughed heartily. "Ha ha! No, laddie, the only biscuits you'll see on the Smeaton are mine. I'm just an old salt who actually likes them." Then he grew more serious. "You're a fortunate boy, Jamie Scott, for you have Mr. Stevenson looking after you. He feeds us well. No use having weaklings when you're building the Bell Rock Lighthouse." Jack Lamont pulled a piece of bread from one pocket and a slice of cheese from another and offered them to Jamie. They tasted good. When he was finished, Jamie pulled his knees up under his chin and studied his new home more closely. "Who's the man with the scar?" he asked suddenly. "That's Tom Bright. You want to keep away from him. He's a mean type." Jamie shuddered when he thought of the twisted mouth and the voice so similar to his father's. Yes, he would certainly keep away from Scarface. "But why does he have such a face?" persisted Jamie after a time. "I don't know. Some say he used to be in the Navy." Jack Lamont shrugged his shoulders. Perhaps he was wounded? Then he peered intently at Jamie in the gloom. "But you keep out of his way whenever possible, you hear? And especially when he's had a dram, for he drinks a lot and he's often violent." He looked reflective for a moment, as if recalling past incidents. "Aye, Tom Bright," as if that said it all. The Smeaton was a small vessel of only 40 tons, and it was not possible to avoid Scarface for long. That very day the wind picked up, and with much bellowing of orders from Captain Mitchell and ee-hi-hoing from the crew, the anchor was hoisted and the Smeaton set sail from the Bell Rock for Aberdeen. Soon she was scudding along before a fine southerly breeze with the rocky Buchan coast to port. Jamie was scrubbing the deck when Tom Bright appeared beside him. "So you're back with us, eh?" Jamie stayed silent and kept on working, trying to look preoccupied with his job. "What's wrong? Lost your tongue?" But Jamie didn't dare even to look round at the hideous face, and presently Bright left. That night Jamie lay on the same tarpaulin in the hold, restless and excited. Only that morning he had crept out of his box bed at home to run away, and now here he was, many adventures later, on a ship bound for Aberdeen. It had all been very exhausting, and soon he fell asleep, cradled by the sea and crooned by the gulls. The next morning there was Aberdeen, the harbour cluttered with masts from many lands, and Jamie eagerly drinking in the new sights. There were quite a few whalers in port, perhaps part of the famous Hudson Bay fleet he had heard about. He had seen the occasional whaler at Arbroath, but never before such an array of gleaming harpoons. That day the crew of the Smeaton toiled hard, loading huge blocks of roughly cut granite into the hold. Many of the stones were over 2 tons in weight, and all hands were needed to work the heavy crane tackles. It was strenuous work for a boy of 12, but with Captain Mitchell watching like a hawk from the quarterdeck, Jamie struggled harder than anyone for fear of giving him the excuse for a beating. Then it was back to Arbroath on the next available tide, and another exhausting day unloading the stone, to be taken by horse and cart to the masons at the workyard for cutting into shape. By the last block, Jamie was completely spent, and he could barely haul the rope in his hand. But the captain was still watching every move, and he struggled on. Then suddenly he felt the rope being pulled strongly for him, and there beside him stood Tom Bright, his huge hands heaving away easily. Fearful, but with renewed vigour, Jamie joined in again, but Scarface never caught his eye and did not say a word. When the block was safely ashore, Jamie flopped down for a rest. But when he next looked round, Tom Bright was gone. To a tavern, someone said. That night he returned fighting drunk with a broken bottle still in his hand, and Jamie crept nervously down into the hold to sleep. So it went on for some weeks, with the Smeaton plying regularly between Arbroath and Aberdeen, ferrying the rough stone blocks with which the lighthouse would be built. Jamie never saw Mr. Stevenson, nor even the Bell Rock, but he grew strong and tough and accustomed to the lashing of the sea spray on his face or the whistling of the wind through the rigging at night. It was a man's world on board the Smeaton, for the language and the violence amongst the crew was grim, but Jack Lamont kept Jamie out of trouble. "Just you go off and check the cargo in the hold," he would suggest sometimes, and Jamie would sit down there in the darkness, listening to the shouting and drunken singing and the occasional smashing of glass going on above. Then one Friday evening, when the unloading was done and the vessel lay tied up by the harbour wall with all but the watch ashore, Jamie went home to his mother. It was a tearful reunion, with much hugging and laughing and questioning, and when he left again to catch the new tide, there was weeping again, but Jamie was pleased with his visit. Mr. Stevenson, true to his promise, had sent his pay home regularly, and though it was not much, it was enough to feed the children and their mother. He was proud of this, and promised to return whenever he could. That night his 2 little brothers followed him back onto the pier, and as the Smeaton glided out of harbour on a midnight tide, Jamie could see wee Charlie and William standing together at the end of the sea wall, watching him go. Shortly after this, The Smeaton was ordered to carry finished stone from Arbroath to the Bell Rock itself, and an excitement swept the crew. This would be much more important work, it was said, for now the actual lighthouse itself was about to begin. Everything was soon ready for the first block, and that day Mr. Stevenson arrived at the harbour to supervise its loading into the hold. By now, a number of carefully masoned blocks had begun to gather on the quayside, all very strangely cut, with lots of corners and joints, which, when put together, would fit together like a huge jigsaw. A block and tackle were erected, and then, under the command of Mr. Stevenson himself, each stone was lifted with great care and slowly lowered into the hold, where Jamie and several other men swung it into the correct place. This was a vital job, for not only would the stones be useless if chipped by careless handling, but they had also to be expertly arranged in the hold to avoid them sliding about in stormy weather. When it was completed, Mr. Stevenson came on board to talk with Captain Mitchell, but presently he climbed down into the hold for an inspection. Almost immediately, he noticed Jamie. "And good morning to you, Jamie Scott," he cried, clambering over the cargo towards him. "How is your mother? Have you heard of your father yet? And my, what a fine big lad you are now. Ha! It's grand what a bit of life at sea can do for you." Jamie flushed with pride. Here was Mr. Stevenson himself, so concerned with building his lighthouse and all the problems he must have, actually able to remember the story he had told him weeks before. It was an incident which Jamie never forgot for the rest of his life. Soon the Smeaton, with Mr. Stevenson still on board, was heading for the Bell Rock, and in a short time Jamie saw the curious house on legs appear over the horizon. They anchored just off the rock, and a number of barges were towed out and tied up alongside. Then the precious stone blocks were once more carefully hoisted out of the hold and onto the barges to be taken ashore to the rock. By now, a swell was making it difficult to keep the barges directly underneath the blocks as they were lowered, so Jamie fastened a knotted rope and threw it over the side of the Smeaton. Then he climbed down and, holding on with just one hand, used the other to help keep the barges in position. It was cold and dangerous work for any man, but Jamie struggled on, and indeed it worked. Just then, a head looked out over the quarter-deck. "What on earth?" exclaimed Mr. Stevenson. "Well done, Jamie Scott! Ha! We'll get this lighthouse started yet. Come on, Mr. Man aboard!" His words were cut by an urgent cry. Jamie looked round just in time to see a head disappearing into the sea, and without hesitating he let go his rope, dropped down into the water, and swam strongly for the place where he saw the man fall. Salt water stung his eyes, and his own clothing dragged him back with the swell, but then he glimpsed a coat, and with a despairing snatch he lunged and grabbed it. For what seemed like ages he clung grimly to the jacket, but then welcoming hands caught him from a longboat, and he was hauled, shivering and frightened, out of the sea. For a moment he lay in the bottom of the boat, fighting for breath. But then he became aware of someone else. The man he had rescued. He rolled over. It was Tom Bright. That month, the Smeaton made several more voyages to the Bell Rock, until one day Jamie could actually see the stump of a lighthouse growing from the rock. "Look," he cried excitedly to Jack Lamont, "there's something to see at last." There seemed to be great merrymaking going on in the curious house, and that day the crew of the Smeaton were also allowed to go ashore. Jack Lamont and Jamie were in the first longboat, and soon they were on the Bell Rock for the first time since that day weeks earlier. "Why are you celebrating?" Jack asked a man resting on a sledgehammer. "Why? We've completed the first layer of stones above ground," replied the fellow happily. But Jamie was puzzled. "Well, that doesn't seem much," he said, but nothing would dampen the workman's pleasure. "No, laddie," He smiled patiently. "We've been out here on this god-forsaken rock for 2 seasons now, and so far all we've managed to do is build the barrack house and chip away the foundation hole. Then, thanks to you sailor boys, we received the first of the blocks." He turns round to look at the house on legs and called, "God bless you, Mr. Stevenson, sir." Then he peered intently back at Jack and Jamie. "Not a single mistake with any of the stones, you know. And all thanks to Mr. Stevenson. He's a grand man." "Well then, laddie, that completed the first layer, but still there was the pumping." "The pumping?" "Aye, lad. When the tide comes in, the rock disappears and we climb up into the barrack house. But then when it goes out again and we climb down again, the hole is full of seawater and we have to pump it out before we can fit more stones into place. At least, it was like that until today, for we've just slotted home the last of the second layer of stones, and the whole thing stands up above the rock. So no more of that terrible pumping," he concluded triumphantly. And he shook Jack and Jamie warmly by the hand. "Come on, sailor boys, come and have a dram." And he led them to the barrack house, as he called it. By now the wind was rising, and Jack and Jamie were happy to follow the man up the rope ladder to the shelter of the door. When they clambered in, they found the entire room full of workmen, all singing and drinking in celebration. It was a smelly, happy place, and Jamie instantly loved it. Then between the legs he spotted the black dog Rab, so he had still not left his new home. Somehow Jamie knew that Mr. Stevenson had relented and found work for old Archie in the barrack, and it did not surprise him a bit. The house was a warm and cosy place, with white painted boarding and moss pushed into the cracks of the woodwork to keep out a snell sea wind. There was a window, which was now shuttered, and a stove in one corner. A ladder led to the room above, from where a cook now appeared to a great cheer with a platter of fresh oat cakes. Someone else started playing a lively tune on a penny whistle, and in a moment everyone was carousing to the tune of Johnny Cope, happy and sweaty and swaying from side to side with the ale and the beat of the song. It was ages before Jamie remembered the Smeaton. "The boat! How are we going to get back?" He dug a rather drunken Jack Lamont in the ribs, but his friend just groaned and flopped sideways. "Wake up, Jack!" He shook him vigorously, but it was no use, for Jack just lay there with a contented smile, gradually sliding to sleep. Jamie pushed through the men to the door. With an effort he forced it open, but to his horror all he could see was waves. The rock was submerged. The Smeaton was still there, but how was he going to reach her, and what would Captain Mitchell say? What was worse, the wind was still rising, and white-flecked waves were racing across an ominously grey sea. But just then he noticed a rowing boat pulling steadily through the white horses to the barrack house. For a time he could not distinguish the oarsman, for he sat with his back to Jamie. But then, as the boat drew alongside the rope ladder, he saw that it was Scarface. The great flood of relief was now mixed with curiosity. Why Tom Bright? But the man said nothing, merely gripping the ladder as if waiting for Jamie to descend. It took some time to manhandle Jack Lamont to the door, and in the end he was then lowered by a rope slung under his arms, but eventually he reached the rowing boat. Then Jamie jumped in and took an oar. "Captain wants to sail," grunted Scarface. "It'll be quicker if I row myself. Less trouble from the captain for you." And he said no more, while he rowed powerfully back to the Smeaton. There was a rope ladder dangling over the side. "You go first," said Scarface, "and go straight to the hold. Captain Mitchell's mad now, but he'll cool off." Then he swung Jack over his shoulder and also climbed on board, while Jamie sneaked into the safe darkness down below to wonder about Tom Bright. Why was he so rough, when he could also be so kind? Why did he say so little? But then Jamie fell asleep, and when he awoke, the Smeaton was under sail for Arbroath. Chapter 4. Bad News. It was on a September run from Dundee with a cargo of rope that the Smeaton ran into the first bad storm of the year. Jamie was sitting down in the hold with a delicious smell of new rope all around, whittling a grey seal from a piece of driftwood. Jack Lamont was crunching on one of his hard-tack biscuits and watching his young friend at work when he looked up suddenly and glanced about him. Perhaps he had noticed the wind or the persistent creaking of the Smeaton's ropes. "The sea's running a bit today, Jamie. Looks like you'll be enjoying your first North Sea storm." Jamie knew exactly what he meant, for he had often stood on the harbour wall at home watching waves smashing over the rocks with a thundering power that sent tingles all through him. But what would it be like at sea? By now, the Smeaton was already pitching about, and just then there was a cry for all hands on deck. Jack and Jamie clambered up out of the hold to find Captain Mitchell on the quarterdeck shouting orders. "Reef in the sails! We're in for a bad one!" he was bawling through a rising wind, and Tom Bright was already at work. All around, the sea was a sullen grey, capped with white and rising higher with each wave. "You two! Get those hatches battened down!" Jack and Jamie went to work, through a steadily rising squall. Soon the Smeaton was running sea water along the deck as rollers tumbled down onto the vessel, swirling round Jamie's feet and numbing his hands in the wind. Above him the sails made a terrifying din, roaring in the wind while Scarface and others in the crew struggled to save them. At the stern, the helmsman fought with the wheel as the rudder, caught in a running sea, kept tugging free from his strong hands. Beside him stood Captain Mitchell, shouting orders through cupped hands, caring nothing for the spray in his face. It was grim work for every man on board the tiny Smeaton. Then an enormous wave hit the vessel, and a solid wall of grey water seemed to charge straight at Jamie. In an instant he was thrown from his feet and sent tumbling backwards, but then a rope ran through his flailing arms, and desperately he clutched tight. Then it was all over, and there he was, lying in the scuppers, drenched but safe, with Jack Lamont laughing heartily through the wind. "Aye, laddie, it's a grand storm!" But Jamie did not think so. It was the first of several gales that autumn, each worse than the one before, and by late October some even carried sleet with them. But then Mr. Stevenson summoned the Smeaton to the Bell Rock, and they took off all the workmen from their barrack house to the safety of Arbroath. Even old Archie and his black dog Rab were persuaded to leave their home, and the strange house on legs was abandoned to the winter's wrath. By now, some 4 feet of lighthouse also stood on the rock, but as the Smeaton sailed off and the tide came in, this stump sank slowly beneath the waves. When spring came, the men would return, but for now they were off for a much well-deserved rest. But not the crew of the Smeaton. All through the winter they were kept busy, ferrying supplies to the 10 other Scottish lighthouses, and what an adventure that was! In gales off the terrible Cape Wrath, in the far north of Scotland, the storms were so awesome that the vessel's main boom was swept away, and the waves almost swamped this tiny sloop as she fought to round the 250-foot-high cliffs. Even in better weather it was difficult work, unloading casks of sperm oil on some lonely jetty for the lighthouse at Elaine Glass one day, perhaps loading coal for the keeper on the Mull of Galloway the next, but it helped to make a man of Jamie Scott. Then one day there was sent up the River Tay to collect stone from a quarry near Perth. Now this river is normally a quiet, tranquil place, where fishermen catch fine big salmon and bulrushes for thatching grow along the banks, but this weather it was frozen. "All hands! All hands on deck!" came the familiar cry from Captain Mitchell, and Jamie woke up from a well-earned sleep to find huge ice floes coming down the river. "Every man to the gunwales!" came the order. Grab a boat hook, anything you can, and keep those icebergs away from the ship. She'll never last." And there they were, Jamie and Tom Bright and Jack Lamont and the others, fending off enormous lumps of floating ice while the helmsman guided them up the river to Perth. It was dangerous and difficult, but the Smeaton survived, and an exhausted crew were soon put to loading 2-ton blocks of rough-cut stone into the hold. Soon Jamie was totally spent. He had fought for hours against the ice, and had done his bit loading the blocks, and he simply slid to the deck and fell asleep. He was rudely awakened by a sharp pain and a loud bellow. "What's the meaning of this, boy? Sleeping at work? Is this how a stowaway repays Mr. Stevenson's kindness?" There was a sarcastic edge in Captain Mitchell's voice, but Jamie was too exhausted to care. "On your feet, boy. We'll have no slackers on this vessel, boy." And the captain kicked Jamie hard in the side. "Move, boy. There's a wind rising. I'll not be delayed by wasters like you." And he marched off to urge on someone else. "Come on! Wind's rising. Can't stay long." The captain was shouting to someone else, legs astride, hands on hips in command. Soon flurries of snow started whirling down from a leaden sky, and the wind began to pick up steadily. "Come on, laddie," muttered Jack urgently. "We'll be in a fine mess if we don't get back down the river before this snow hits us." The two of them worked on, but it was tiring work hauling on a pulley with a 2-ton load. How Jamie just wanted to fall asleep where he stood. The hours passed and the work went on. There was no stopping, even for a meal, with Captain Mitchell striding up and down the deck, and all the time the weather was worsening. The snow became heavier until they could barely see the far side of the river. Then the wind grew stronger and whipped across their faces like a lash, leaving frozen snow clinging to their eyebrows and breath fighting in their throats. Soon it was a raging blizzard, with the wind howling and the snow blanketing everything on board the Smeaton. Then, somewhere through the shrieking gale, Jamie heard Captain Mitchell bellowing, "Get those hatches closed! Cast off forward! We'll make Dundee yet! Come on, you men! Look alive!" Slowly, the Smeaton crept out into midstream and started off back down the river. "The man's mad," Jamie heard Jack muttering to himself. "We'll never make Dundee in this weather. Mitchell's mad." And then, just as if to prove the prophecy, another vessel appeared out of the snowstorm, her sail torn to a shred and her hull high up on an ugly rock. A seaman was struggling in the water, but then he vanished into the murky white, and Jamie never saw him again. For a moment he saw the stricken vessel keel over sideways, but then it too disappeared into the raging swirl of snow. Then Captain Mitchell appeared. "Up the rigging! Every man up the rigging!" But he caught Jamie's arm. "Not you, boy! You'll take the wheel, boy!" "He's never helmed, Captain!" shouted Jack Lamont in protest over the din. But Mitchell tightened his grip. "The wheel, boy!" Jamie glanced at Jack. "Don't worry, Jack," he said suddenly. "I'll get you to Dundee." And he stumbled through the drifts on deck to the wheel. The helmsman gladly handed over, and soon every man on the Smeaton was up in the rigging while Jamie, lonely and bitterly cold, gripped the wheel and tried to peer into the whiteness. Soon his hands turned blue, then his feet went numb, and in desperation he searched for the slightest sign of Dundee harbour. For a moment there seemed to be a lull in the howling wind. Was the river wider now? Could it be the estuary? Then suddenly Jack was beside him. "Come on, laddie! Dundee's somewhere to port." "Oh, how do you know? I can't see a thing." But Jack hauled the wheel over, and slowly the Smeaton came round. "Been up this river so often now, I reckon I knows every bend from here to Perth. Just you watch, Jamie Scott." And sure enough, there were the harbour jetties, like welcoming open arms, taking the Smeaton into safety. There was a cheer from the rigging as the crew scrambled down, and as they tied up, a snow-bedraggled vessel with icicles clustered under the bowsprit, Jamie Scott and Jack Lamont stood proudly at the wheel. Some days later, the storm abated, and the Smeaton was off again. New Year found her moored at Aberdeen once more. What a place to spend Hogmanay, the crew said. But it passed happily enough in a tavern by the harbour, in a haze of whisky and strong pipe tobacco. Then through the noise they heard the town-house clock chime midnight, whereupon the landlord appeared with a dram for everyone and a slice of the traditional black bun. Someone returned the compliment with a silver coin and a lump of coal to bring the innkeeper luck, and a great cheer went up to welcome in the new year. "Here's to the end of old Boney!" cried someone. "And the end of the Bell Rock Lighthouse too!" shouted Jack Lamont with a laugh. Then, when they had toasted everyone they could think of, it was off to the Smeaton to greet the lonely watchman still on board. As the crew staggered its way along the quay, arm in arm and singing at the tops of their voices, someone noticed a stranger and called him over. "A first foot! Here, shipmate, have a drink!" And off they went again with the new arrival. Finally they stood above the Smeaton, swaying slightly, indeed threatening at any moment to fall into the harbour and calling for the watch. "We've brought you a first foot!" they cried. The stranger had been carefully selected, being both tall and dark-haired, for it would not have done to ignore tradition in such an ancient Scottish custom as first footing. Then he was given a glass of whisky, black bun, a silver coin, and a lump of coal, all to be given to the watchman, and off he went, followed by the rest of the crew onto the Smeaton. Now, tradition having been observed, Jamie knew the ship would have luck for the next year. Soon everyone was assembled in the crew's quarters, cramped and uncomfortable, but who cared? Now it was time for introductions, and with great solemnity Jack Lamont rose to his feet. Taking the only flickering oil lamp they had, he held it in turn before each man's face. Considering how much he had drunk that evening, he did remarkably well. Tom Bright, Ben Fraser, Callum McIntosh, John White, and last but not least, his young friend Jamie Scott, on his first Hogmanay out of Arbroath. The stranger looked very closely at Jamie, peering forwards in the dim lamplight. "Is your father Andrew Scott, a big man with dark hair?" he asked, screwing his eyes up as if trying to remember something through the haze of his drink. Jamie nodded. "Aye, but he was taken by a press gang months ago." "Aye, well, he's not on one of your Majesty's ships now, lad." The man leaned forward even closer, until his nose was barely an inch from Jamie. "Nay, lad, he'll be in a French prison, for I was the only one who escaped when they took the frigate Spitfire." Chapter 5. New Work. Jamie's mother showed little emotion when he told her of her husband. "It makes little difference," she smiled ruefully. "At least he'll not be killed in some battle anyway." She studied her son, seated by the firelight. "My, you're a fine lad, Jamie, and how you've grown up." He watched his mother for a time and decided she was not crying. Perhaps she really was proud of him. Perhaps he really was keeping them alive. Jamie thought of his brothers and sisters, fast asleep in the other room. "How are the others?" he asked, poking the fire and trying not to seem troubled. His mother smiled, almost with contentment. "We, Charlie and William, think the world of you, Jamie. And they're going to the school now. William doesn't like that Dominie at all, just like you, that's William. And you should see Catherine. She's fair taking to this spinning business. Quite a bonny lass she is now. You'd hardly know how she's blossomed. She and Mary have a grand time tying each other's hair." And that night Jamie slept content in his box bed at home. Before his mother blew out the candle, she came to him and stood for a time watching his serious face, rugged already from the sea life. How he had changed! But then she saw a half-finished model of the Smeaton lying by his feet, so he was still whittling, and she slept content too, for she had not yet lost her little boy. In April, work began on the Bell Rock again, and on a glorious sunny day the Smeaton took the workmen back out to the barrack house. Soon they could all see it, still standing solid as ever after the winter storms. And then Jamie saw the lighthouse and pointed. "And not a stone gone," murmured old Archie. "And what else did you expect?" retorted a workman. Soon the men were on the rock, and even before the Smeaton left, Jamie could see them clearing the seaweed and chasing off the seals which had made the place their home while humans were gone. It must be very satisfying to build something, actually to see it grow by your efforts, he thought, and somewhere inside him a new desire stirred. Was it his restless nature, or was there really some deep feeling being kindled by that lighthouse? Then Captain Mitchell appeared, glowering as usual like an evil omen. "Belay this daydreaming," he growled. "There's work to be done. You, boy, haul the mainsail." And he stood back to see the job done properly. Now, a canvas sail is heavy at the best of times, and when soaked by surf and spray, it becomes doubly heavy. But Mitchell hovered there like a hooded crow, smirking, taunting. Anger blazed in Jamie, and he started hauling with all the strength he had. He would prove to Mitchell that he was a man like all the others. But the sail was too heavy and would not move. "Come on, boy! Where's your strength? Happy to be a stowaway, but can't even do a day's work, eh, boy?" This infuriated Jamie, and again he attacked the rope, hauling and straining with everything he had. "Come on, boy!" Captain Mitchell was taunting him again, when suddenly Tom Bright appeared. For a moment he stood facing the sullen captain, but then, with a smack that could be heard all over the boat, he swung a right hook and with one blow knocked Mitchell down. "Just you leave the boy alone," growled Scarface. "He ain't done you no harm. He's a fine boy." And he went off down below, while Mitchell struggled to his knees with oaths and promises about what was going to happen when he reached Arbroath. Jamie ran after Tom Bright. "Why did you do it?" he asked, all fear of the man's ghastly face momentarily gone. "You're the only one I likes on board this boat," he answered simply. "The others won't talk. It's my face, you know. Grape shot at Trafalgar, but they won't talk." Jamie felt a deep shame sweep over him, but Tom Bright went on. "You're afraid of me, I can tell, but you have no prejudice. You're a decent sort." He tailed off as if embarrassed by having said so much. "But you're bound to get into trouble." "Never mind that, lad. I've been in irons many times before. Captain Mitchell can't do anything I haven't had from many another skipper. You see, with a face like mine, I make enemies with every captain. I have fought in many battles for King George, but my face... He tailed off sadly, but then, as if he had forgotten something, he turned to Jamie. "Find another job, boy. This is no place for you. Seamen and rough ways. You see, Mr. Stevenson, get off the Smeaton. You take my advice. Mitchell can find plenty more for you." Jamie did not see Tom Bright when they docked at Arbroath, but how he wished he had never called him Scarface, even if it had only been secretly to himself. Jack Lamont had been wrong about him, he now knew, but he never told his friend. That very evening Mr. Stevenson appeared on the Smeaton, talking earnestly with Captain Mitchell. Perhaps they were discussing Tom Bright, thought Jamie, and he waited in a shadow until the conversation ended and Mitchell had gone back to his cabin. "Mr. Stevenson, sir! Mr. Stevenson!" Jamie called urgently as the gentleman strode off along the harbour wall. Mr. Stevenson turned in surprise, and soon Jamie was blurting out his story. Father a prisoner of the French, eh? He looked thoughtful. Been chased a few times by the French myself, you know, Jamie Scott. I don't suppose I'd care to be their prisoner. Jamie watched Mr. Stevenson's face closely, searching for some flicker of encouragement, but the gentleman kept a mask of formality. And why do you not like Captain Mitchell? A fine seaman, you know, an excellent captain. You must learn to obey Jamie Scott and to take the knocks. Can you take the knocks? Oh, yes, sir. Just you put me on the Bell Rock and watch me take the knocks. Mr. Stevenson laughed at this. Ha, ha, ha! My, the Bell Rock. But you've seen yourself. They're hard men on the rock. It's a dangerous life. I've loaded stone into the Smeaton, protested Jamie. I've unloaded it in rough weather, and I've been through the storms of last winter. Why, I even helmed the Smeaton back down the River Tay in a snowstorm. And at last Mr. Stevenson smiled and seemed to give in. All right, Jamie Scott. I'll let you work on the rock. But it's hard work, mind. It's twice the pay because it's twice the work. Do you think you can work twice as hard? Twice the pay? Jamie tingled. Just you watch. And in a moment he was running helter-skelter to his mother with the news. She cried and laughed and hugged him to her in a confusion of emotions. But Jamie knew that she was proud of him. She kept weeping about how rough it would be, and how he would have to keep his wits about him in such a wild place, but there was relief too, mixed in with her anxiety. For twice the pay would buy more food for the other children and the candles for the dark nights. Jamie decided that mostly his mother was pleased. That evening the Smeaton's longboat glided towards the Bell Rock on a sea like glass. With a gentle bump, it ran onto the seaweed-strewn rocks, and Jamie leapt out. You be careful now, laddie, called Jack Lamont to his friend. Don't worry, grinned Jamie, teasing his friend for being so worried. I'll be all right, and we'll see each other anyway lots of times. We'll need you here to bring the stones out from our broth. What's this wheel? You sound like you're already part of the workforce. Why, only this morning you were still my shipmate. Jack laughed, but Jamie was already scrambling through the dusk towards the barrack house, where a single window showed a light. With a push on his oars, Jack shoved out to sea, and soon he was rowing strongly back to the Smeaton. Jamie was on his own now. He reached the bottom of the barrack house, towering in the gloom above him, and then stumbling on the uneven rocks he crept through the framework of the 6 mighty oak legs to the ladder. He paused at the foot, as if summoning the courage to face a new life in that crowded room above, when a voice suddenly spoke to him from the shadows nearby. Well, well, and if it isn't Jamie Scott, come to join us on the Bell Rock. He turned with a startled look, but it was a kindly voice with no danger in it. It did not even sound surprised. Then Jamie saw the faint glow of a pipe a short distance away, and he smiled. It's old Archie, isn't it? Aye, it's old Archie, just enjoying a smoke in the evening quiet. And it's good to have you back, Jamie Scott. I always said you would come back one day. Jamie crossed to where Archie sat and squatted down beside him. However did you get down the ladder with only one leg? He inquired at last, as if unable to suppress a burning curiosity. Well, now, Jamie, that's my secret. If I ever let on, Mr. Stevenson would have me working on the rock, and at my age, I'd much sooner be minding the stores up there. There was a twinkle in his old voice. But I so enjoy a smoke and a quiet evening down here among the pools and rocks. You're a rascal, old Archie, smiled Jamie, and the old man did not deny it. But then Jamie rose to his feet. I'd better be getting up there myself, for I'm fair hungry. Will there be a bite to eat? Oh, aye, you'll get your broth and your bread tonight, and every night, for Mr. Stevenson sees that we never lack food. It's a fine life for an old man. Easy work, plenty of food, wages for tobacco, and lots of friends. Aye, it's grand. Jamie laughed and set off again for the ladder, but Archie called him back. Here, take this, he said, pressing a piece of chocolate into Jamie's hand. But that's chocolate! Jamie had never even held such a luxury. Wherever did you get that? Well now, Jamie, that's another of my secrets. But when you get up there, I want you to give it to Rab, my dog. To Rab? A piece of chocolate? Just you give it to Rab. You'll never regret it. Archie pressed the chocolate into Jamie's hand, emphasising the advice. Then Jamie climbed the ladder and pushed open the door at the top. The men paid little attention when he scrambled in, for they were used to new arrivals. Mostly they were lounging around near a brick stove, talking and joking as men do. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and body smells, and the wonderful meaty tang of a Scotch broth. Someone had a large pot of soup simmering on the stove, and suddenly Jamie remembered how hungry he was. "Can I have some soup, please?" he asked a large man beside the stove. The man moved aside. "Aye, lad, just help yourself to a bowlful." "But I haven't got a bowl," said Jamie dismally. "I didn't bring one with me." His voice tailed off disappointed, for he had never had soup on the Smeaton. "Well now, a new man here but without a bowl, that's not a fine start." A few men nearby laughed, and Jamie was not sure if the man by the stove was taunting him or not. But then someone tossed a tin plate into his lap. "Here, laddie, someone left this behind, so you might as well have it." And in no time at all he was swallowed into the evening life of the barrack house, sitting there among the workmen with his broth, knees up under his chin, laughing at the rough jokes and supping away hungrily. Then suddenly he spotted the black dog Rab among the legs and bedding, and he remembered old Archie's chocolate. Rab seemed to be watching the new arrival closely, perhaps even reading his mind, for a moment later there he was, nuzzling into Jamie's hand like a long-lost friend. Jamie pulled the chocolate cautiously from his pocket, keeping it hidden from the men around for fear that it might be snatched away. But then he carefully shifted it to a place below his hunched-up knees where he could see it, and for ages he sat there just looking at it. How he longed to eat it himself! He had once sipped a little hot cocoa, but he had never even seen real chocolate before, and how the delicious taste of that cocoa came back to tempt him now. But then he remembered old Archie's advice. Just you give it to Rab. You'll never regret it. And reluctantly he slipped his treasure to the dog. In an instant it was gone, and Rab had scuttled under a bunk to guard his new prize. All Jamie could see now was a pair of black shining eyes watching the humans, almost challenging anyone to come near. It was too late for Jamie to regret it now. That night he found an empty bunk, high up above two others, and soon Jamie fell asleep amidst the grunting and spluttering snores of 30 other men in the barrack house. Rab jumped up and settled himself at Jamie's feet. But then, when all was quiet, old Archie returned, and Rab left Jamie for his proper master. Next day, work began on the rock at 6 o'clock. Chapter 6. On the Rock. A chilly wind, the kind that snaps at every bone in your body, was shrilling across the rock as Jamie peered out of the barrack house door. The sky was leaden grey, flecked with streaks of dawn, but the tide was already ebbing, so it was time to start work. Much of the rock was already exposed, and there were pools of water lying everywhere, glistening darkly against the gloomy rocks. It was not much of a welcoming sight for a first morning, but Jamie pulled his jacket tighter about him and gingerly followed the other men down the ladder. "You'll be on the bogies," said one man, pointing to a strange railway which snaked from the water's edge to the lighthouse stump. It stood on curious girder legs of different heights, so that the rails were more or less level above the uneven rock, and already men were shoving little wagons along it to the landing place. Then Jamie saw the familiar shape of a sloop moored some distance off, and presently 2 barges bringing the cut stone blocks ashore. Soon he could see the oarsmen working rhythmically together, and even the helmsman of the first barge standing tall at the stern, his powerful arms steadying the vessel through the swirling currents of the receding tide. It must be Jack Lamont. Jamie ran headlong to the landing place, stumbling over seaweed and through the pools of seawater until he stood at the waterline waiting for the closest barge to come nearer. And then he saw it was not Jack, and in the spreading light of the day it was not even the Smeaton lying out there, but some other sloop, and disappointment swept over Jamie. Now he was cold and wet and miserable. What a way to start his first day! But then, as the barge approached the rock, the excitement began as ropes flew out to the oarsmen and the sluggish craft was hauled the last few yards into a tiny inlet for unloading. 5 times the eddying swell snatched the boat back out to sea again, and once a hawser snapped like a thread, sending a tug-of-war-like team of workmen crashing backwards onto the rocks. But finally, the barge was moored safely, and a fever of hauling and straining ensued as several huge stone blocks were carefully lifted by a derrick out of the hold and manoeuvred into the nearest bogie wagon. Soon Jamie and another man were pushing the wagon along the railway to the lighthouse, where they helped unload it for another crane to haul it 20 feet or more up to the workmen on the lighthouse. Then it was quickly back to the landing place again, for by now the second barge was unloading while the first was heading back for another load of stone. Every stone was a new challenge, for as the barges moved about in the swell and the men cursed and hauled on the derrick rope, a foreman was bellowing instructions so that the stone would not swing and crash into anything. "Just one knock," he was growling with a menace that seemed to reach even the toughest workmen around him. "Just one chip, and that block will be useless, and it's no pay for the man who lets it fall." The men were straining and hauling on a huge block when suddenly it seemed to slip. Someone was slithering on the seaweed. Quickly, Jamie and some other men joined the workers, struggling frantically with the rope. "It's going!" shouted someone, almost like a warning, for the heavy block was swinging like a pendulum between the sea and the rocks, dragging the men ever closer to the water's edge. Jamie did not fully realise the danger, but he could see that it was a desperate moment, and without another thought, he plunged into the water. For a moment he fell about, struggling to find his feet, but then he realised he was standing on solid rock, and with the water now swirling and tugging at his legs, he clutched up at the passing rock as it swished over his head. "Hold that block!" you could hear the foreman bellowing. "Not an inch more!" But the huge stone was still creeping down closer to the water as the men struggled vainly to stop 2 tons of granite crash into the sea. Jamie made a despairing grasp at the enormous block above him. The first time he missed altogether, and on the return he only skinned his knuckles, but then he caught a rope tied around the block, and pulling desperately, he watched as the block came slowly to a stop above him. "Well done, laddie," the foreman cried. "Now get out of there before these puny men let go of that rope altogether." He gave Jamie a great clap on the back as he struggled out of the water. "Right now, you men who call yourselves strong, get that barge in place. We'll lower back in and try again. Come on, men! Heave!" And so the work went on, fast and furious, until every stone was away and the men fell back exhausted. Jamie was so pleased with himself, and a few men grinned at him in tired friendship. But there was no time to stop, and Jamie went on pushing bogies to the bottom of the lighthouse and back, drenched and cold, but triumphant. Meanwhile, the rest of the rock was also alive with activity. Men were mixing cement and staggering under heavy buckets of mortar to the lighthouse, where it was hoisted to the workers up on the tower. A tall column of smoke rose from one place where the blacksmith pumped away on his bellows, encouraging his fire with a curious mixture of coal and venomous threats. When not pumping, he sharpened blunted picks for a line of men waiting for their turn, for in a place like the Bell Rock, only a few blows were enough to ruin the sharp edge of a pickaxe. Up on the lighthouse itself, the stone blocks were being manoeuvred carefully into each pre-selected place by a squad of men and a curious balance crane which could be dismantled and moved up as each new course of blocks was completed. Each block was slotted exactly into place like a giant jigsaw, first onto a bed of cement and then finally kept in place by huge spikes driven down through narrow holes in the stone. There was a wonderful atmosphere of purpose and energy about the Bell Rock that day. But then Jamie suddenly noticed that he was standing in water. The tide was coming in, but he had another block to push before he could stop. "Come on, lad," said the man with him. "The tide'll be here in a moment, so let's get this bogey moving." Even as they struggled to push the wagon, Jamie could see the water rising higher over the rock, creeping steadily into places where minutes before there were only quiet pools. "Come on!" cried someone from the lighthouse. "We don't want to be stranded up here. Get a move on with that wagon." There was a scuffle to tie ropes round the block, but then it was hoisted steadily upwards to the waiting men, and Jamie sagged down onto a rock, exhausted suddenly, now that it was all over. Just then, there was a tremendous hissing noise from the blacksmith's forge as the rising water finally extinguished his fire, and with that, the workmen on the lighthouse stump grabbed their tools and descended quickly. "Come on, laddie," said someone, nudging Jamie as he hurried past. "You don't want to be washed away, do you?" Jamie started. He must have been dozing, and realised the tide was suddenly much higher. Hardly any of the rock could be seen now, and he quickly followed the others to the barrack house ladder. Soon the door was closed, and down below, the Bell Rock disappeared completely from sight. Just then, the trapdoor from the room upstairs opened, and Mr. Stevenson climbed down into the men's bunk room. "Good work, men," he cried in greeting. "That was a fine spell today. Good to get decent weather for a change, eh?" And the men laughed, but Jamie didn't find it funny at all, for he was huddled in a corner, shivering and trembling with cold. After all, he was the only one who had been up to his armpits in the sea that day. Then Mr. Stevenson spotted him. "Well now, Jamie Scott, and how was your first day on the rock? Did you do a fair share of the work? Did you earn your pay?" Jamie felt wretched, but he forced a weak smile. "Well, I'm tired, sir, so I reckon I did my share." Then he brightened up a little. "And I rescued a stone block from falling into the sea." "Well, well, you must tell me about it." Mr. Stevenson crouched down to Jamie's height, and the men round soon lost interest in their conversation. Soon he was describing how he had stopped the heavy block from swinging out of control, while Mr. Stevenson listened closely. "Well now, that was a fine thing to do, Jamie, but here's a surprise for you. Why, there's not a man in this room hasn't done something like it. That's why they're here, for I pick only the best for the Bell Rock. I pay them well, not just to work hard, but to be brave." Mr. Stevenson looked closely into Jamie's face. "Do you remember telling me just yesterday how you could take the knocks? Well, now you understand what the knocks are. Everybody takes the knocks here, gets wet or takes a risk, for we're a team, Jamie. We'd never get this lighthouse built if we all thought only of ourselves." "But it is getting built," smiled Jamie. "So we must be a fine team." "Exactly. They're all heroes in here, and it looks like I've found another. But remember, that's what you get paid for." Mr. Stevenson stood up and gave Jamie a reassuring smile, like a father with a disappointed son, for he could see that the lad was sorry not to be such a celebrity after all. "Now, you get yourself dried off and have some porridge. It's only breakfast time, you know. You've still a whole day's work ahead of you still." "A whole day's work," bleated Jamie miserably as Mr. Stevenson climbed back up through the trapdoor. Then suddenly the whole place was laughing. "Ah, what's so funny?" snapped Jamie crossly. "I'm not afraid to say I'm tired, and I did save that stone block." And he stomped off into a corner, while the men still laughed. Then his friend hobbled over. Now, Jamie," grinned old Archie through his straggly beard and the stump of his pipe. "You'll have to learn to take a joke with us all out here on the rock. But don't worry, there will be no work until the tide goes out again." "It's always funny, though, how every new man forgets that on his first day. Mr. Stevenson's wee joke works every time." "Every new man. He said new man," thought Jamie happily to himself as he fell asleep. He was wakened by the black dog Rab licking his face and old Archie leaning over him with a bowl of porridge. The bunk room was quiet now. Men were sitting around killing time until the next tide. A few slept in their bunks, some were reading or writing letters, others smoking quietly on long white clay pipes. "Come on, laddie. Better take this or you'll die of pneumonia on these wet clothes. Everyone's tired after a shift on the rock, but they always know how to get out of wet clothes first thing when they get inside." And soon Jamie was sitting in a corner between two bunks, feeling the wonderful warmth of his porridge creep through him. Then old Archie produced a battered old fiddle, scraped and dented by the passing years. "Ah, no, not the fiddle," groaned the other workmen in chorus. But Archie gave Jamie a sly wink and reverently lifted the instrument from its case. Then, tucking it under his beard with great ceremony, he drew the carefully across the strings with a sound very similar to a cat with asthma. And with a look of disdain, he now proceeded into a mixture of scrapings and wailings on his fiddle, which old Archie, at least, seemed to find very moving. "Oh, good!" exclaimed one man with mock enthusiasm. "He's playing Cutty's Wedding. My favourite tune." "That's never Cutty's Wedding," protested another. "Why, it's Macpherson's Rant." And suddenly the place was a babble of argument as people suggested what tune old Archie's terrible scraping noises were supposed to be. Finally Archie put his fiddle down and with great solemnity said, "That tune was Maggie Lauder, and I'll have you know that I learned to play from the great Neil Gow himself, so I'll not be having any more criticism from ignorant folk like you." And the whole place laughed, for even old Archie knew that he was a dreadful fiddler. Then old Archie took Jamie aside. "As you can see, lad, I can't play a note on this old fiddle, but I did learn from Neil Gow when he and I were both younger." He tapped his forehead with a gnarled forefinger. "It's all in my head, Jamie. All the music Gow ever played in my head, and I want to teach you." Jamie's eyes were like saucers. "Me? Why me? I'm only good for whittling bits of wood. Why, there's no music in my blood. We've been weavers for generations, but never fiddlers." "Never you mind about that," urged old Archie. "I'll teach you, and one day you'll be a grand fiddler, fit to play at your sister's wedding. Wouldn't you like that?" Jamie thought of home, and his two sisters tying their hair and growing up. One day they would marry, he supposed, but only after he had provided for them now. It was like a challenge. If he learned to play the fiddle for Catherine's wedding, the whole family would have to be there for the event. It committed him to work on now, to see them safely through this time without his father. He began to tingle, as he always did when he felt nervous but excited. "I'd like to learn." And old Archie smiled behind his grimy beard. Chapter 7. The Storm. The next day, everyone was up bright and early for the dawn tide again. Jamie was awakened by Mr. Stevenson clambering down from his room above. "Come on, you men," he was crying with a good-natured poke of his walking stick at some of the lazier workers. "There's a grand sea out there, flat as a mill pond, and the Smeaton will be here in no time at all. Come on, show a leg." Jamie rolled over to get up, but then he felt a tremendous stiffness all over. Every muscle in his body ached as though he had just been in some grand fight. "What's so wrong, Jamie Scott?" he heard Mr. Stevenson saying. "Stiff all over, are we? It means you've been working hard, lad. Probably the first decent day's work you've ever done, eh? Captain Mitchell's been too soft on you." Jamie knew he was only teasing, and he grinned back, but inside he didn't think it funny at all, for it was painful even just to move. "Come on, Jamie Scott," Mr. Stevenson was teasing again, prodding him with a stick. "The sooner you get to work, the sooner you'll forget about being sore. The Bell Rock, laddie, that's the place to get you fit and strong." He gave a jovial wink and went off to prod some other sleepyhead. "He's in a fine mood today," said one man as Mr. Stevenson left. "I haven't seen him so cheerful in a long time." "Says we should be able to reach high water mark today," said someone else. And Jamie didn't really understand. "What's so special about that?" he asked, and the men looked round in surprise. "Why, then the lighthouse tower will be above even the highest tide. We'll be able to work continuously on it, and even the cement won't get washed away all the time." The man looked closely at Jamie. "Do you drink strong beer?" "Not yet," he said. "Well then, you'll not be too bothered about crossing the high water mark, but we're going to have a great time tonight." And with a cheer, the men clambered down out of the barrack house. "Come on, lads," someone was shouting. "There's a barrel of ale if we get it done today." And painfully Jamie followed them down the ladder, while old Archie chuckled at his miseries. Just as he reached the rock, Jamie saw the Smeaton laying offshore. This time it really was the Smeaton, and there was Jack Lamont coming ashore at the landing place. Jamie stumbled over, across the pools and seaweed, calling, "Jack! Jack!" "Well, now it's Jamie," cried Jack as his young friend ran up to him. "And how's life on the Bell Rock after a whole day here?" "Goodness, is that all it is? It seems like ages. I'm stiff from all the work, and I've made loads of friends, and I've given the chocolate to Rab the dog, and I'm going to learn the fiddle, and I'm on the top bunk." And so Jamie chattered on in an excited babble of mixed-up news, while his friend just laughed. "Well, you certainly seem to be happy," smiled Jack. "But do you not have to work?" Jamie's hand went to his mouth. "Oh dear, I've been blethering to you, and there's Mr. Stevenson watching. I'd better go." Jamie waved quickly and ran off to the railway bogies. "Don't forget to tell my mother I'm fine," he shouted. "Next time I get a chance, you go and see her. She'll give you a fine soup and you'll meet my brothers and sisters. They'd love that." Jack laughed. "All right, Jamie, I'll see your mother." But then it was time for the barge to return for another load of stone from the Smeaton, and for Jamie to push hard in the wagons, and he did not see Jack again that day. Then, just as the tide was coming in and the rocky pools were beginning to disappear under the sea, there was a tremendous cheer from the lighthouse. The men had done it. They had completed the layer of stones which took them above even the highest tide. "Well done, men!" Mr. Stevenson was standing waving his stick and smiling, with his feet in the rising sea. All work now stopped as the men shinned down from the lighthouse and ran for the ladder up to the bunkroom. Only the blacksmith was left behind, swearing like a trooper as he hurried to collect the hot embers from his fire in a special box. Perhaps he thought that the beer would all be gone by the time he caught up with his workmates, but on the other hand, he had to save the cinders for his next fire, so he hopped about frantically with rosy coals dropping and hissing into the sea all around as he tried to shovel them hastily into his box. Then, soon even the smith was running across the rock with his precious box, slithering and stumbling with dreadful oaths in his anxiety to join the celebrations. When he finally clambered in through the bunkroom door, there was a great laugh. Mr. Stevenson was there too, with a large Bible under his arm. He looked round the gang of workmen, and there seemed to be great pride in his eyes. "Aye, you're a fine bunch of men," he said at last, "and it's a great day for us all. I have made you work through storms and dangers when I should not have done, and with God's help we have survived and even triumphed in this desolate place. And now we must thank God." The men crowded round Mr. Stevenson, and those in the middle joined hands, making a kind of basket upon which the Bible was laid. Then a foreman read a passage, with the sea surging through the legs of the bunkhouse and the wind humming through cracks in the wooden walls. And high above the waters the gang of rough workmen stood with heads bowed and caps in hand, while Mr. Stevenson said a prayer. Then, suddenly, the serious atmosphere snapped when the black dog Grab barked in the silence, and soon the men were laughing again. The long-awaited barrel of beer appeared, and in moments the ale was flowing merrily, and someone was playing on a penny whistle. Old Archie threatened to produce his fiddle too, but by then things were becoming boisterous in the barrack house, and he thought the better of it. Jamie lay on his bunk, looking down on the sweaty, smelly but welcoming scene as the men joked and jigged around him. This was a good place to be, he decided. The work was hard, but it was a good place. As more days passed, the lighthouse tower began to rise again. A rope walkway was thrown across from the barrack house direct to the top of the stump, and men now worked constantly in shifts on the lighthouse. Whenever winds and tides were favourable, supply ships would sail out from Arbroath with more cement, or new tools, or the precious stone blocks which Jamie would push on his bogey to the waiting builders up on the tower. It was exhausting labour, straining one moment like a cart horse in the shafts of some impossibly heavy wagon, pushing with blistered hands and shoulders the next like Sisyphus, condemned in hell to roll a huge boulder to the top of a hill from where it always fell back to the bottom, so that he always had to start all over again. It was grinding, repetitive, back-breaking toil, but there was a reward, for now each day Jamie could see progress on the tower. Another foot higher, the doorway rising gradually to its lintel stone, they were all exciting landmarks to Jamie, watching from ground level as the days and then the weeks went past. And then one day, the storm came. Old Archie looked out of a window from the barrack house. For a time his craggy face studied the horizon, then he pushed some tobacco into the remains of his clay pipe. "Have you ever been in a storm, Jamie?" he said. "For you're going to be in one today," he added, without waiting for the reply. "Well, we had many storms on board the Smeaton," said Jamie, with just a hint of cocky pride in his voice. "We had the rudder swept away once off Cape Wrath, and the main boom ripped away once off Galloway, and there was yon snowstorm coming back down the Tay, and aye. But have you ever been in a matchwood hut 60 feet above a raging sea, terrified for your very life?" Old Archie sucked reflectively on his pipe stump. "Aye, laddie. Today's the day when we'll see how brave you can be." "Oh, you just watch," said Jamie defiantly. Though truth to tell, he was not feeling at all brave now. Gradually, the wind began to rise. Someone battened down the window shutters in the barrack room with strong spars wedged into brackets on either side. Soon Jamie could hear the wind moaning through chinks in the timber walls. By now, large quantities of moss had been stuffed into most of these cracks by workmen tired of having draughts chilling them at night, but somehow the wind still seemed to discover every unnoticed gap, and now it was whining eerily all round the room. Outside, the sea ran to a dull grey, angry and foaming over the deserted rock below. Soon the waves were swishing through the legs of the barrel house itself with a trembling rush, and dashing against the half-completed lighthouse tower with a surging roll that could be heard clearly up in the bunkroom. By now most of the men had stopped whatever they were doing. Now they listened with tight, concentrated faces to the pounding of the sea outside. One by one, they extinguished pipes, or put away books and papers, until a terrible silence fell upon the room, with the men just sitting there, waiting for the unknown and listening to the waves. It was like a tiny world of frozen silence marooned in a sea of storms. Outside, solid water was now running through the upper struts of the barrack house legs. That meant waves at least 40 feet high, more even than Jamie's house in Arbroath. Then, as the sea swelled and ran higher still, waves began snapping at the walls of the bunkroom itself, gently at first, but soon whipped up into a tremendous fury by the howling wind outside, until the whole building trembled and shuddered under a ceaseless bombardment from the sea. Tons of water dashed against the walls with terrifying din, and now seawater began to spurt through cracks in the walls as each wave hurled itself against the barrack house. Inside, many of the tough workmen were frightened, more than they had ever been before. Some huddled by the fireplace, where a warm glow gave them an excuse to crowd together for comfort. Others lay on bunks, gripping the wooden edges with white knuckles, and a few said prayers with a desperation found only in terror. Jamie sat on his bunk, watching the others. Mostly he was frightened too, and every time the room shuddered his heart was in his mouth, but part of him was excited by the noise and the danger. He didn't dare come down from his perch, for up there he had something to hold on to. It was rather like the Smeaton, where he found that by holding tight to something familiar when the vessel was pitching and tossing, he could conquer some of the terror in his heart. Only this was the worst storm he had ever known. Just then, there was a sudden crashing sound, and in an instant one window was broken and the shutter splintered as if smashed in by a battering ram. Then it flew open, and for a moment a flood of grey water poured into the bunk room, swilling round the floor and dousing the precious fire in the hearth. Then it was all over, but now pandemonium reigned in the bunk room. "Get that window barred again!" A foreman was already bellowing orders above the racket of the storm, like a sergeant major in battle, and 2 men now tried to fasten new spars across the torn shutter. While one man tried to force it flat against the gale outside, the other hammered desperately as a constant spray of stinging seawater spat into his face. And while he hammered and shouted, the dog Rab leapt up beside Jamie on his bunk high above the flooded floor. He put an arm round his companion, and they both found comfort together. Down at floor level, men were cursing and shouting in a chaotic babble of voices, for with every wave that hammered on the walls of the barrack house, tins of tobacco, precious belongings, books and papers and candles fell from shelves into the sea water. And yet, through all this commotion, old Archie just sat in a corner, seemingly unconcerned, puffing on his pipe while the winds howled and raged around him, and the bunkroom shook and shuddered as if about to fall apart. Just then, the trapdoor above opened, and a shower of water drenched the men below as Mr. Stevenson poked his head out with a cheerful grin. "Are you men all right?" he cried above the noise. No one dared complain about the water. "No one drowned? Still enough tobacco?" It was a friendly inquiry, perhaps, to show the men that he, at least, did not share their panic. "I will manage fine, Mr. Stevenson," replied one man, irritated but careful to be polite to his master. But just then, another huge wave thundered into the barrack house, and everything trembled so violently that cracks even split through the fireplace, and several bricks shook loose. More seawater jetted through the sodden, moss-filled cracks, and a new cascade of water showered down through the open trapdoor. A chorus of protest went up from the workmen. Rab barked furiously, and some men clutched for their belongings, certain that the whole building was about to break up. "You should see my room," cried Mr. Stevenson, with a mischievous look towards Jamie. "I've got a constant downpour coming through the ceiling. Waves are passing right over the roof. Oh, wait till I find the man who made my roof. Why, I've nothing left that's still dry. You men should be grateful, for it's my water-logged room sheltering you." He disappeared and closed the trapdoor, leaving Jamie wondering what he had done with all those charts and plans usually spread out on the floor upstairs. Even through his fear, silly thoughts came to him, like what would he do if the rain soaked all through the plans? Would he know what to do next? Would Jamie still have a job on the Bell Rock? But then his fears were interrupted by an exasperated cry. "Well now, if that's not the last straw!" Jamie looked down to find old Archie surveying his pipe, extinguished by some spurt of water. And with a hobble and a bit of a splash, Archie clambered onto his bunk and went to sleep, just like that. Jamie must have slept a bit too, but mostly he remembered spending a miserable night huddled under wet bedding, listening to the wind howling round the barrack house like a tribe of demented witches, and the waves crashing endlessly against the walls. He could tell from a space in one shutter when dawn came, for a lifeless, dull daylight shafted into the room, but the winds still shrilled, and the sea still surged and roared their anger outside. As daylight grew, he found old Archie stretched out in his bunk, sucking the same old pipe, and the dog Rab lying over his master's foot, keeping it warm. Most of the other men slept on, or at least they appeared to, for the place was loud with snufflings and snorings from lumpy shapes on every bunk. Jamie shivered and realised that the room had lost its normal fuggy warmth. The fire was long out, doused when the storm water had flooded into the bunk room earlier. He got up and started collecting firewood, while old Archie watched from his bunk. They seemed to be the only two alive in the thin grey light of the room. "Here," said Archie presently, and he pushed over a box. "The blacksmith's box. You'll need this." "He'll be mad," grinned Jamie, whispering quietly for fear of waking any of the others. "Aye, but he'll be warm." And using the blacksmith's precious embers, Jamie soon had a fire going again. For a time the storm seemed determined to extinguish it at once, for squirts of water seemed to leak through the walls everywhere. But then Jamie found a pile of old torn canvas sails under one bunk, and stuffing these into the worst places, he managed to stem the flow of water. Soon the fire was burning merrily, and old Archie was cooking a fine big pot of porridge. "Big Tam the blacksmith won't mind so much when he's had a bowl of my porridge," said Archie. "Yes, he will," said Jamie. "You've forgotten the salt." But old Archie was a great one for getting in the last word. No, Jamie, the way I cook it, the salt only goes in when it comes to the boil." And he gave Jamie a comical, glowering look, as if challenging him to prove him wrong. "Why are you not afraid?" asked Jamie after a while, as the two of them sat looking into the flames of the fire. Old Archie gave a weary look, the sort that every old man gives when he's about to speak from experience. "Well now, Jamie, what good does it do to fret? Does it help you to sleep? Or give you a grand appetite? Or pass the time of day any faster?" "No, of course it doesn't. But you can't help being frightened in this place. What if the legs are swept away? We'd all be killed, and my family would have no one to look after them." Archie could see Jamie's bottom lip trembling, and he smiled. "Aye, Jamie, you are right to worry about them. But when you reach my age and you've had a long life, you get to a time when it's just not worth the trouble to worry any more. I'll go when the Lord is ready for me, and so will you." "Do you think he wants me to live?" asked Jamie. Old Archie puffed on his pipe for a bit. "Well, this place still stands now, doesn't it? And the lighthouse tower still stands out there. And you and I are still alive, and here we are, sitting before a fine fire, cooking a grand pot of porridge." The old man smiled reflectively through his straggly beard. "Aye, Jamie, I think he wants you to live. Besides, you haven't learned to play my old fiddle yet." And the two friends smiled together, while outside the storm screamed its venom and the seas thundered deep and loud. Chapter 8. A New Season. For 4 days storms lashed the barrack house, but when they finally subsided and the weary men climbed out, they found not a strut or spar from their home missing. And when they examined the lighthouse, they found every stone block still there. One or two stood on their spikes as if on legs, but not a block had been lost. Thousands of tiny pebbles littered the rock, and some huge boulders had been tossed up out of the ocean right into the centre of the work area, but the railways still stood, and the landing area was still clear. "It's a miracle," one man said, amazed to find everything still there after such a storm. "Nonsense," cried another. "It's Mr. Stevenson." Jamie could see Mr. Stevenson nosing about all over the rock, checking everything, clambering everywhere, with a satisfied look all over his face. But just then, someone noticed a vessel ploughing through the waves, and soon the next cargo of stone blocks was being unloaded. Once more, Jamie was shoving heavy bogies along the railway to the foot of the tower as the business of lighthouse building got underway again. More weeks passed, and then in October Mr. Stevenson stopped the work on the Bell Rock. Winter storms would soon be upon them, he explained, and it would be impossible to work since the supply boats would be unable to reach them from Arbroath. Some of the men were temporarily laid off until the spring, but others were kept on and sent to do jobs in other places. Jamie was kept busy loading stone blocks at quarries up and down the coast onto carts to be taken to Arbroath, but he was allowed home for Christmas and Hogmanay too, and his mother wept when she saw how big and strong he had become. On New Year's Eve, the whole family stayed up to hear the town clock strike midnight. Even Jamie's youngest brother Charlie stayed awake long enough to see in the new year, and Mary and Catherine put on new dresses specially sewn for the occasion. They could not afford much more than a simple jup or frock, but it pleased Jamie no end to think that his work was giving them such pleasure. Then, just before midnight, as they all sat round the fire chattering happily, there was a loud knock at the door. Jamie answered, and you could have knocked him over with a feather, for there stood Jack Lamont, grinning from ear to ear. "And how's my old shipmate Jamie Scott then?" he cried. "I was going to be your first foot, but then I thought it a shame to keep you waiting for this fine bottle of sherry here, so I decided to come early. And look what else we have here." Jack seemed to call out to someone else behind him. "Come on, show yourself to the Scots." And with a sheepish hobble, old Archie appeared, with Rab still at his heel. What a Hogmanay that was! Jack and old Archie found companionship and a fine warm fire, and Jamie's mother was complimented for her fine Dundee cake, and the girls were so excited when Jack pulled 2 beautiful green ribbons from his pocket and presented one to each of them, declaring that this would now make them the prettiest lasses in Arbroath. Then Archie produced his fiddle, and to some incomprehensible but at least rhythmic tune, they all did reels and jigs into the wee small hours, while Rab barked, and little Charlie slept in his box bed, oblivious to the music and laughter. Towards dawn, Jack and old Archie left to visit other friends, and Jamie's mother showed them to the door. "Thank you so much for coming," she said before they went. "It's good to know that Jamie has such fine friends, and you have made us all so happy tonight." As she closed the door, Jamie could see that his mother was crying to herself, and he knew why. "Don't worry, Mother," he said, slipping a strong arm around her. "Father will come home one day. You'll see." In February, the workmen returned to the barrack house, where, once again, they found the workplace strewn with winter debris, but not a stone or spar missing. To begin with, the bunk room was improved by sealing off the draughts better and making the roof waterproof. But then the main body of workmen arrived, and soon the more important business of building the lighthouse resumed. Before long, the solid base for the tower was complete, and even the first floor of the hollow part was nearly finished. You could see the doorway and one window, and a stairway was beginning to spiral upwards inside the tower. After this, every new stone block seemed to add visibly to the growing lighthouse. By now, the workmen were toiling whenever possible. Sometimes so many blocks would be landed from the barges that there was plenty of work to keep the men busy, even when the rock disappeared under water again. By using the rope walkway from the barrack house, they could cross over without first descending to the rock, and so they could also keep working even when the tide was in. Eventually, even Big Tam the blacksmith moved his forge and anvil to the top of the tower, hoisting up further each time a new section was completed. Occasionally, strange ships were attracted by his spiralling smoke and came rushing to the scene, thinking some vessel to be on fire, but mostly the work went on unhindered, and you would hardly have known even about the war in France. One or two workmen were caught by the Arbroath press gang and were released only after explanations from Mr. Stevenson himself, for his men were supposed to be exempt from this. But mostly the construction work went on steadily all spring and summer. Sometimes, when the tide went out at night, but it was also not too cold, the work was done by torchlight. Enormous faggots of burning wood, 10 or more feet tall, were driven into the rock or even fastened to the tower itself, and the men would work in a flickering red glow through the night, resembling the fiends in the lower regions, as one ship's captain said. For Jamie, of course, this was all very exciting, but it was also very irritating, for now he had to push his bogey in only a half-light, and he would often stub his toe on some rock or twist his ankle on the uneven surface. Then there was the exhausting struggle to unload the block and fasten it up to a crane for hoisting up to the top of the tower, but that would be followed by a feeling of great satisfaction, and Jamie always returned to the landing place full of energy for the next bogey. Once Rab decided to visit the rock during one of these torchlight night shifts. He stood at the door of the barrack house and whined loudly as Jamie was about to descend. So he tucked the dog under one arm and released him at the bottom. For a while, Rab ran around happily, snapping at Jamie's heels and chasing around and round the tower, but then a great wave splashed all over him, and after dismally shaking himself dry, he trotted back to the foot of the barrack house and waited there until Jamie finished his work. Then one day, Auld Archie made a public announcement. Now you all know that young Jamie here has been receiving the benefit of lessons on the fiddle. This was received with great laughter all round the bunkhouse, but Archie glared fiercely at the offenders and went on. Some of you will have heard him practising, under my expert guidance, of course, but he'd have done better learning from an old fisherwife. And Archie glared more fiercely than ever, and bit so hard on his pipe that the stem broke and it fell to the floor. By now everyone was laughing, and poor Archie could not restore order, no matter how much he scowled and glared, so instead he just handed his fiddle over to Jamie and clambered up into his bunk, pretending to be in a huff. Then Jamie tucked the instrument under his chin, as Auld Archie had shown so often, and he began playing. Soon the whole room was quiet, as everyone listened to the most beautiful fiddling they had heard for months. Even those workmen who had heard him practising were surprised at the improvement. "It's caller herring," someone said, but he was hushed by the rest, for unlike Archie's tunes, they could all tell this one straight away. And when it was finished, they all clapped loudly and cheered Jamie until he blushed. Up in his bunk, Auld Archie puffed on his shortened pipe with a smug look on his wrinkled hairy face. "It's all that I can play," confessed Jamie after a time. "Aye, but we'll soon teach you a few more," interrupted Auld Archie, satisfied that he had scored a point from those who liked to tease him. "And one day you'll be able to tell people that you were taught by a great man." Everybody laughed, but at least they never mocked Auld Archie again for his fiddle playing. And on dark nights when the winds whistled and the men were gathered round the bunk-room fire, they would ask Jamie to play caller herring again and again until they were all made miserably homesick. Occasionally Mr. Stevenson organised other entertainments for his men, for he realised that it was not good to be cooped up in such a small place for days on end. Men become irritable and argumentative if they have no outlet for their energies. So boat races were sometimes held in calm weather, using longboats borrowed from the stone-carrying sloops. For a time, there were 2 complete teams, and Jamie had no chance to join in the races. But then, one day, someone was sick, and he was at last asked to take part. Generally, a keg of beer was put up by Mr. Stevenson himself as the prize, so the competition was needle-sharp. Jamie knew this, of course, for he had often laughed at the colourful language which came drifting back to the rock from the 2 competing crews as they rowed out to Marker Buoy. But now it was different, for he would surely receive the blame if his team lost. As it happened, the Smeaton appeared off the rock that day, and her crew also issued a challenge to both bunkroom teams. Naturally, this was immediately accepted, and soon after the sloop's longboat appeared, with Jack Lamont leading the team. He gave Jamie a cheery wave. "Too bad about the beer. Looks like your old shipmate's going to get it." "Not if we've got anything to do with it," cried Jamie, and his team gave a hearty cheer, as if to stress that they were not going to be denied the prize by a boatload of sailors. Then a cannon went off, and instantly there was a feverish pulling on oars and bellowing of instructions. "All together, men! Together, you dafties! Come on, they're gaining on us! In, out, in, out, in, out!" Jamie sat beside Big Tam the blacksmith and pulled for all he was worth, although it was easy with such a brawny man on the same oar. But then the big man said, "Come on, Jamie Scott! You're not pulling, I'm doing all the work." "I am pulling," said Jamie indignantly, but he tried harder anyway. When they reached the buoy, the other bunkroom crew was slightly ahead of the Smeaton's boat, and Jamie's team was lying third. By now, all 3 coxswains were going hoarse as they shouted instructions and orders. In, out, pull, you landlubbers! Why, you couldn't even beat the French!" Well, that riled them into even more effort, and on the way back to the rock most men worked harder than they had done all week. "Come on!" Jamie's coxswain was shouting. "We'll catch them yet!" And slowly they overtook the Smeaton's crew. Jamie wanted to cheer, or perhaps stick his tongue out at Jack as they inced past him, but he was working much too hard for that sort of distraction. Now they were pulling up on the leading boat, and Big Tam was sweating like a cart horse, muttering terrible oaths under his breath as he dragged the heavy oar to his chest with each stroke. Gradually, the gap between the long boats began to shrink, and Jamie could barely conceal his excitement. "We're going to catch them!" he suddenly cried, forgetting all about rowing for a moment, until Big Tam swore and Jamie remembered where he was. But even then the gap was too wide, and with a great cheer the other boat passed the winning marker first. Then Jamie's boat also swept past, and the crew slumped over their oars, suddenly drained of all energy. Finally, the Smeaton's crew arrived, dispirited and embarrassed, and were greeted with hoots of derision by the winners, while Jamie could only look round weakly in time to see Jack Lamont wiping the sweat from his eyes. Well, at least they had beaten Jack, he thought, but he was too tired to poke fun at his friend. Soon after, a ceremony was held on the rock in which Mr. Stevenson presented the winners with their barrel of beer. Naturally, there were triumphant smirks from the victors and glum faces among the losers, but then Mr. Stevenson produced a surprise. "Now, as you all know," he called out above the noise of the sea, "the second team were without their stalwart oarsman Tom Jenkins. Young Jamie Scott took his place, so it's his first race. Perhaps that's why they lost." "Ha! Quite right!" cried Big Tam. And before Jamie knew what was happening, he had been hoisted over the blacksmith's shoulder and was being carried to the water's edge. Then someone held his feet, and with a 1, 2, 3, he was thrown into the sea. For a moment the cold numbed him, and he panicked, and then the eddying currents dragged him away from the laughing spectators on the rock. No one seemed to realise the danger, but the cold had clamped onto Jamie so suddenly that now he could hardly breathe. He frantically waved an arm in the air, but everyone on the rock knew he could swim, and so they laughed all the more. Then suddenly the black dog Rab appeared, leaping over the rocks and seaweed, and with a great bark dived into the water. Jamie desperately grabbed at Rab's collar, and with something now to hold on to, they both dog-paddled slowly back to the rock. Then Hans caught him and pulled him ashore. He was safe. For a while Jamie was too bedraggled and shaken to speak his mind, and so he allowed himself to be helped up into the bunkhouse, and there he sat down by the fire in warm clothes. Someone gave him a bowl of soup, and slowly the shivering subsided and the cold was chased off. "Well, now, that was a bit daft, wasn't it?" said Big Tam. For a moment anger blazed in Jamie, but then he saw old Archie quietly shaking his head in the background, and he held his peace. "Aye, so it was. We'll just have to win next time, won't we?" Everybody laughed, and in the background old Archie nodded. Chapter 9. A Punishment. Boat races and fiddle playing were all very well, but these were pleasures snatched only during moments of recreation. Most of the time work on the lighthouse continued night and day, for now 3 stone-carrying sloops ferried backwards and forwards from the workyard at Arbroath whenever the weather permitted. Mr. Stevenson was determined to complete the tower that year, and sure enough, as the weeks went past, everyone could see that the lighthouse was indeed growing steadily upwards. But it was sair work, as Big Tam the blacksmith said, for now the blocks were coming so fast that there was hardly time for a breather between completing one and starting the next. By this time, Jamie had grown into a big, strapping lad, with strong, powerful arms now that he had been pushing bogies for 2 whole seasons on the Bell Rock. It was exhausting work for a boy like Jamie, but it had certainly given him a fine weather-worn appearance. Many people in Arbroath did not recognise him any more. Once, when he had a few days ashore, he passed the dreaded Dominie down by the harbour. Jamie was glad to hurry past, for he could still remember the terrible scoldings he had suffered at the school, but the Dominie suddenly stopped. "Is that you, Jamie Scott?" he said, turning with a faintly surprised voice. Now, if there was one man Jamie would rather have avoided, it was the schoolmaster. "Aye, it's me," he mumbled, staring at the ground for fear of catching the other's hawkish eyes. "But how you've grown!" cried the Dominie. "I hardly recognised you." Then he peered closely at Jamie. "Have you a job, then? They said you were off to sea yon day when you ran away from the school. Well, how's life without an education, then?" There was the hint of a sneer in his question, but Jamie decided not to rise to his bait. "I'm doing fine," he mumbled again. "I work on the Bell Rock." The Dominie looked impressed. "Well, it seems to have done you some good anyway. And I hear your father's in the Navy now," he added, as if unable to resist the temptation of a snide remark, for it was obvious he knew how Jamie's father had joined the Navy. "No, sir," Jamie answered quietly, again refusing to get angry. "He's a prisoner of the French. I work on the Bell Rock to support my family in these difficult times, and that's why I left the school. Now, if you don't mind, sir, I must hurry to catch the tide." Jamie hurried off, but the Dominie was too clever and had the last word. "The Bell Rock work won't last forever, Jamie Scott. Then where will you be without an education? Why, you can't even write your name." And the words echoed mockingly round his ears as Jamie ran down to the harbour. Soon he was back on the rock again. By now the lighthouse had grown past the 3rd floor, and it was a long pull for the men lifting stone blocks up to the workplace. As the tower grew higher, it became impossible to secure the derrick crane guy ropes to the rocks so far below, but the balance cranes still worked, and each day the men hauled many stones up and fitted them into place. Most difficult were the blocks for the tower's spiral staircase, for they were curiously shaped, which made them more difficult to handle, and they had to be slotted into an awkward place so that there was plenty of heaving and pushing and salty language when a stairpiece was being fitted. But of course, each new tread on the steps was a sign that the tower was growing. The shape of a lighthouse becomes narrower as it rises, and as this tower grew taller, the workspace available at the top became more cramped. By midsummer, it had become quite dangerous, for by now the lighthouse was over 70 feet high, but a small army of men congested the tiny space at the top, all elbowing each other for room to work. There were men with huge sledgehammers for driving iron spikes through the blocks already in place, others coming and going up the spiral stairway with buckets of cement, and more with trowels spreading the mortar while the giant stones swung above their heads as they were manoeuvred carefully into their particular jigsaw places with the crane and ropes. It was purposeful work, for by now the tower was beginning to look like a lighthouse, but the men were always grateful when the cook gave a shout from the barrack house. Then they would all clatter downstairs and cross by the walkway to the bunk room for their broth and a bowl of stew. Sometimes Mr. Stevenson would come down from his room upstairs and share the meal too, but mostly he seemed to be busy with plans and diagrams. "I think we can get the tower completed this season if God grants us some decent weather," he told them one day, and they all gave a great cheer. Meanwhile, in preparation for that day, I have been designing a new light for the lamploo room. The end of the work is in sight. Soon we shall have a famous landmark in Scotland, which mariners the world over will talk about. Then who will speak of the Eddystone Lighthouse? And the workmen laughed, for Mr. Stevenson knew how to win their support. That very day, a man had lost his forefinger, accidentally cut off when a crane cable suddenly ran free. Any factory master would have dismissed him as being unfit to work, but Mr. Stevenson promised the man easier work on the rock. One day, Jamie and quite a few of the others were on board the Smeaton going home for a few days' rest, when there was a shout from the seaman on watch. "Sail on the port side! Closing in quickly!" Everyone rushed to the side, and sure enough, there was a vessel under full sail, obviously overtaking them. The Smeaton was a babble of questions. Who was chasing them? Was it the Royal Navy? Or the dreaded French, perhaps? What would they do if it was the French? But then Captain Mitchell appeared to calm everyone down. "It's a Navy cutter!" he cried over the voices, waving a fine brass telescope about. "We'll have to stop and find out what she wants. But don't worry, the taverns will still be there when we get to Arbroath." A relieved cheer went up, and the Smeaton's crew began reefing in the sails. Soon the pursuing vessel was alongside, and everyone could hear the other skipper shouting through cupped hands to Captain Mitchell. "Good day, Captain!" The voice hovered in the wind, but Jamie could clearly make out the message. "They say there's a Dutch frigate about in the Firth of Tay. It's been seen off Dundee." A murmur of concern rippled through the crowd of workmen at the ship's side, but others quickly hushed them as the cutter's master went on. "They tell me we have no naval ships in the Firth at present, so do be on your guard. If there's any sign of the enemy, head straight for the nearest seaport. It will be your only chance against a frigate. Good luck, Smeaton." Then, with a wave, the captain disappeared and the two vessels moved apart. Canvas billowed out, and quickly the cutter sailed off, leaving the Smeaton alone again. Immediately, an excited chatter broke out among the men on board. An enemy ship nearby! Jamie was half excited and half nervous at the thought of facing a Dutch warship, though a French one would have been more exciting still, he decided. Some of the men rushed to the bows to scan the horizon, but there was nothing to see but a few fishing smacks off the coast of Angus. Jamie was almost disappointed when they reached Arbroath safely, for he never saw the Dutchman that day. A few days after that, when Jamie was tired from pushing his bogey, Jack Lamont suddenly appeared by his side. "Where did you come from?" asked Jamie in amazement. "Why, the Smeaton's out there delivering stones again." But Jack did not seem very natural today, and Jamie could tell at once that something was wrong. His friend was normally so full of jokes and teases when they met, but now he seemed more serious. "I've just been into Arbroath," he said at last, "where I met your sister Catherine down by the harbour. She told me your mother was ill, so I went round to your house. She's been taken with the smallpox, Jamie." A year or two earlier, Jamie might have burst into tears at news like this. But the responsibilities he had shouldered had given him a maturity beyond his age. It appeared at times like this, and he just sat there on the rock quietly. "Is she dying?" he asked eventually. "I don't know, Jamie," said Jack. "I can tell smallpox when I see it, but you know what Dr. Robertson's fees are. I couldn't afford to call him." Jack looked so sorry for his young friend. "Of course you couldn't, Jack," said Jamie. "Why, I'm earning more out here on the rock than you do." "The children are living with your neighbour, Jock Henderson, and the girls go in to care for your mother each day," said Jack. "Aye, but John can't afford it. He's a weaver too, and you know how the trade has disappeared these last few years." "No, it's my job to look after them." Jamie stared out to sea for a moment, turning different ideas over in his mind. But then he suddenly turned to his friend. "Jack, I want you to get me back to Arbroath today." "Don't be daft, Jamie," said Jack. "They'll miss you out here, and then you'll be sacked. Then where will you be?" But Jamie had that insistent look on his face. "That's my problem, Jack, and I'll face it when it comes. Now, let's go to Arbroath." Jamie simply went down to the water's edge, jumped into the barge which Jack had brought to the rock, and without explanation lay flat in the bottom. He had no idea if anyone had noticed, but there was no shout, and soon he felt Jack push off and head out to the Smeaton a short distance away. Then he did the same again. He just clambered up the rope ladder which dangled down from the vessel's side, cleared the handrail with a vault, and disappeared smartly down into the hold before anyone could say anything. Mercifully, Captain Mitchell did not seem to be on deck, and presently the vessel set sail for Arbroath for another load of stone. So far, so good. Jack did not visit his friend, and Jamie presumed that he was too busy. The sea was very placid, though, and one hatch was left off so that Jamie could hear people moving about above him, and sometimes he heard Jack's voice. "Well, Davy, with a fine wind like this, I reckon we'll be in Arbroath soon," he was saying to someone. But Jamie smiled to himself, for he knew the information was really meant for him. A short time after, 2 hard-tack biscuits dropped down into the hold. When Jamie discovered what they were, he grinned. Trust Jack to tease him at a time like that. Soon the Smeaton docked, and after a few minutes, Jack's head appeared in the rectangle of daylight above. "Everyone's ashore, Jamie. I volunteered to stay behind and watch, so now's your chance. Off you go!" And before he was finished, Jamie was out and away, running pell-mell down the harbour walls and through the streets and closes, past the ruins of the abbey on the hill until he reached his own door. He was breathless and exhausted when he burst in, but his mother was too ill even to turn her head at the commotion. He went to the bedside, and she smiled weakly. He knew she was pleased that he had come, and he had decided it had been the right thing to do. Just then, Catherine came in, and her mouth fell open in amazement. "Jamie! How did you get here? Did you get Jack Lamont's message?" But Jamie was already leaving again. "Yes, I did. You're a sensible lass, Catherine, to think of Jack," he called back to her as he ran off down the road. "But where are you going now?" she wailed, bewildered now at what was going on. "Dr. Robertson," she heard him cry back, though by then he was already out of sight. The doctor lived at an imposing villa just outside the town, and Jamie was panting hard when he reached the front door. A tall, portly man with an enormous forehead appeared, towering over Jamie and looking not very pleased at his loud knocking. Yes. For a moment, Jamie just stood there, fighting to regain his breath and with no idea what to do next. Excuse me, sir, but are you Dr. Robertson? He managed to say at last. I am. And what does a scruffy boy like you want from me? My mother has the smallpox, and I need you to help her, Mistress Scott, in the town. He was still panting hard, but he was pleased that he had persuaded himself to go this far. The very idea of him standing there on the doorstep of the doctor's house. The tall man leaned forward until his great big forehead was close to Jamie's, and the boy could smell coffee on his breath. But I charge fees, boy, he said, not roughly, but firmly, making it clear that he wanted to see the colour of Jamie's money before he would come with him. And then, quite suddenly, Jamie burst into tears, weeping unashamedly and uncontrollably until the doctor became quite angry. You must stop this! I shall shout you out if you do not cease this dreadful bawling. Stop it, I say! Jamie could not stop completely, but he managed, between enormous heaving sobs, to explain that he had no money. He had come straight back from the Bell Rock when he heard the Bell Rock! Well, why hadn't he said so? Why, the doctor knew Mr. Stevenson very well, and what with one thing and another, Jamie eventually persuaded the doctor to visit his mother. I shall pay you, sir, he promised when he was sure that his mother was being properly examined. Then he ran off, and was back on board the Smeaton telling Jack of his adventures before the others arrived and the loading of stone began. It was dark when the vessel returned to the rock, and for a time Jamie waited impatiently for Jack to tell him when to go. Then at last he heard a whispered call, and soon he was crouching on Jack's barge and heading for the landing place. Watching the fire-lit rock from the sea was an amazing sight, and Jamie just sat there gazing at the shimmering red glow in the water. But then suddenly the barge grounded gently. Well, Jamie, said Jack, now you must face Mr. Stevenson. As luck would have it, Mr. Stevenson was standing nearby, directing the unloading of the stone blocks. It was not long before he spotted Jamie, even in the wavering ruddy light of the burning torches. Jamie Scott! Come here this instant! He sounded very cross. But Jamie was relieved that at least now the tension of waiting was broken. Of course, his heart was pounding away like a carronade cannon, but he stumbled over the seaweed, trying as best he could to show he was not nervous. Your cap, boy! Snapped Mr. Stevenson. Show some respect! And Jamie hastily snatched off his bonnet. Now get up into the bunk room and wait for me there. I'll deal with you in a moment. It all sounded so ominous, and Jamie dismally climbed up into the barrack house. He found old Archie there, but the old man said little and just sat puffing quietly on his pipe. Jamie decided that Archie must also disapprove of what he had done. Then Mr. Stevenson arrived. Up to my room, boy! And Jamie followed him up through the trapdoor. Almost immediately, Mr. Stevenson turned on him, looking extremely vexed and angry in the light of an oil lamp which stood on the table. Perhaps you should tell me where you have been today, he demanded. And Jamie miserably explained what had happened. It may have been a sad tale, but Mr. Stevenson's face was like granite. When it was over, and Jamie stood waiting with his bonnet in hand, he paced up and down for a bit, perhaps deciding what to do. Jamie prayed that he would not be sacked. Then Mr. Stevenson turned. So, you left your work here, work of the highest importance, which will save thousands of lives in years to come, caring little in that moment for others. Then you deceived Captain Mitchell by hiding in his vessel. Jamie was about to protest, but he bit his tongue in time, and Mr. Stevenson continued. And you disturbed Dr. Robertson, although you have no money with which to meet his fee. What have you to say for yourself? Does that sound like the sensible young man I once took you for? Why, you have let me down, and your mother." "But she is ill, sir," said Jamie at last. "When I heard that she was sick, I had to do something. I've been helping her for 2 years and more. I couldn't just let it all go to waste." Then something in Mr. Stevenson's manner seemed to change, and he seemed to mellow a little. For a time he looked into the glow of the oil lamp, and Jamie, anxiously scanning that face for a sign of forgiveness, could see that he was very sad. "2 years ago," he said at last, "3 of my own dear children died of smallpox. First there was little Janet. Then Thomas and Elizabeth both died in June when I was out here on the Bell Rock. But I did not go home." Mr. Stevenson looked so sad now, and it was obvious even to Jamie that he loved his family back in Edinburgh as much as Jamie loved his in Arbroath. "You see, Jamie Scott, my work here is more important than my family life. This work is for all people who sail in the sea. We all have sacrifices to make. Can you understand that?" Jamie nodded, but although he felt sorry for Mr. Stevenson, he was thinking to himself that he would have gone home if he had been in his place. Then the mood changed, and Mr. Stevenson straightened up like a schoolmaster. "I can understand your concern for your mother, but we must all learn to be responsible, Jamie Scott." He even wagged a finger, and Jamie knew that the punishment was coming. "You cannot just disappear from the Bell Rock whenever you receive bad news. What would happen if every man behaved like you? Now, this time I shall not dismiss you, but you will forfeit 2 weeks' wages. But now get out of here," snapped Mr. Stevenson, "before I ask you to leave the rock altogether." Jamie's mother did not die of smallpox. Moreover, some months later, when Jamie returned to the doctor's house to pay his bill, he was told that it had already been settled weeks earlier. They would not tell him how, but Jamie had a good idea who had paid. Chapter 10. On the Tower. By July, the lighthouse tower was over 80 feet high, and the work was nearly over. Some workmen were even sent from the rock to Arbroath, where they were to build cottages for the lighthouse keepers who would soon come to man the tower. Then the balcony stones began to arrive from the workyard. These were massive blocks, and there was a terrific struggle to get them ashore intact. Mr. Stevenson was everywhere, pointing with his walking stick, measuring with a tape, calling here and there, just like a general in battle. "Come on, Jamie," he cried one day. "Don't just sit around waiting for the next stone. Find something else to do. We're short-handed now, so you can always find work. Look, they need more cement up there. Off you go!" Jamie clambered up to the barrack house. By now the cook's room had also been taken over for mixing cement, and he collected a heavy wooden bucket. It seemed to hold an amazing amount of cement, and Jamie wondered how the workmen could use it up so fast. But then he set off across the walkway and reached the lighthouse door. There was a tremendous toing and froing up and down the spiral stairway, for everyone seemed eager to complete the tower as soon as possible. But eventually he struggled past, and at last he suddenly reached the top. What a view! For a moment he just stood there scanning the horizon, for he had never been on the tower before, and he had no idea how far you could see. A number of fishing smacks were working some miles away, and further off you could see the white sails of some larger vessel. But just then someone snatched his bucket of cement and gave him an empty one. "More! Don't stop now, Jamie!" And he hurried back downstairs for another load. And so it went on all day, working on the bogey whenever a new stone block arrived, then fetching cement, iron spikes, tools, and whatever else was needed by the men on top of the tower. Slowly the shape of the lighthouse balcony began to emerge. The blocks here were specially carved to give a fine rim for the top of the tower, and they hung out beyond the walls of the lighthouse itself so that the keepers would have space to walk round the lamp room. This was important, because they would have to keep the glass clean from bird droppings and sea salt, but what a view they would also have! Jamie was so busy fetching and carrying for the other workmen that he did not notice the changing weather. But then, as he reached the top of the stairs again, he heard Big Tam shouting at the others, "Come on, lads, we want to get this finished before the weather closes in. Where's the cement? Cement! Here it is," cried Jamie as he stepped out onto the crowded workplace. "Aye, well, don't stop now. We'll need all we can get quickly. Don't want to be up here any longer than necessary today with that wind rising." Jamie rushed off with another empty bucket, but now he was just a little nervous, for even he could see that the wind was blowing stronger. The sea was that ominous grey again, and white flecks were running here and there like playful cats with claws. By the time he set off with a new bucket full of mortar, he could tell that the wind had risen. Waves were dashing onto the rock below, sending spray snapping at Jamie's heels as he crossed the walkway to the lighthouse. Gradually, a gale developed, and soon Jamie's hands were blue with cold as he struggled up and down the stair with more cement. At the top of the tower, of course, it was much worse, for here the wind tugged at his clothes and blew in his eyes so that he had to grab hold of Big Tam's jacket. "Hey, let go! Do you hear? You'll have me over the side if you're not careful." Even the brawny blacksmith was nervous on top of the tower in such a strong wind. Just then, an enormous wave smashed down onto the rock and sent spray right over the top of the lighthouse tower so that water went trickling back down the stairs again. Then another wave swept over the rock to slap against the tower itself so that it swirled up the smooth walls higher even than the doorway before flopping back down with a great splash. "Come on! Get that last stone in place," a foreman was shouting above the whistling wind. "Everyone who can, get hold of that rope. We'll get this slotted in yet." Jamie caught the crane rope along with several others, and together they all pulled and lowered inch by inch until the huge curved block of stone was fitted into place. It was difficult work, for salt spray slashed into Jamie's eyes, and the wind numbed his hands so that he could not feel the rope. But in the end, it was done. And as the men scampered down the steps, one last giant wave smashed into the tower, and a great flood of water came tumbling down the stairs, drenching everyone before they could escape into the bunk room. For a moment, they hesitated at the lighthouse door. For outside, the seas were running so high that the barrack house seemed to be floating on the water one minute, but standing high above it the next. But then someone darted over the walkway safely, and soon the others followed. Jamie was among the first, and as he set off, he could see the green water boiling just below him. For a moment, he seemed to freeze halfway as an enormous wave crashed into the lighthouse tower and showered him with spume, but it lasted only a moment, and then he moved on. "Brave laddie," said Big Tam, and Jamie grinned. "Oh, it's nothing," he answered with a nonchalant air. "You should have seen the storms we had when I worked on the Smeaton. Why, I remember when I was up the mast—" "Aye, we all saw you hanging on for dear life, Tam," laughed old Archie. "Jamie here has been up a mast, and there was you as timid as a moose on top of that great big tower." "You wouldn't have been saying that if you'd been up there with us," retorted Big Tam, looking embarrassed, and they all laughed when old Archie waggled his wooden leg mockingly at the blacksmith. "Have you really been up the mast?" whispered Archie later on. "Of course," said Jamie indignantly. But then he winked, and old Archie did not know what to believe. That night, while the wind whistled and shrieked outside the barrack house, Mr. Stevenson came down from his room with a great roll of papers. "Well, how is the timber holding up this time?" he inquired. "Everything watertight?" The men all nodded, for in truth it was very cosy in the bunk room that year, now that all the cracks in the walls had been sealed. Mr. Stevenson lifted a lantern from its hook on the ceiling and placed it on the table. "I thought you might like to see my plans for the light room," he said, unfolding some documents for the men to look at. Most people crowded round as Mr. Stevenson explained the next step in completing the lighthouse. Even Jamie could understand the beautifully prepared drawings of windows and glass panels with the metal dome which would fit on top and the little chimney which would carry off smoke from the oil lamp inside. There were also drawings of 2 enormous bells, which were to hang just outside the light room from the balcony which he had helped to complete that very day. "What are the 2 bells for?" he asked. "Fog. You can't see a thing when we have one of our famous North Sea fogs, can you? So the lightkeepers will ring these 2 bells as a warning." "Ha! So that's why they call this the Bell Rock," laughed Jamie. "Well, not exactly," smiled Mr. Stevenson. "They say that the monks of Aberbrothick Abbey once hung a bell on this rock to warn ships away, but it was stolen by a pirate called Ralph the Rover. Then one day, as he returned from one of his plundering voyages, a storm just like this one outside blew up. The helmsman could not see where he was for spray and huge seas. A bell might have warned him of this terrible place, but Ralph the Rover had already taken it in a moment of greed, and then when his own vessel smashed into the rock and they were all drowned, or so they say. And so we shall replace the bell. Oh yes, but the light will be much more important. Do you know that the government have spent £60,000 on this work?" Everyone in the room gasped at such a vast amount of money. Many people said it would be better used fighting the French, but I argued long and hard against these short-sighted opinions. I'm sure we shall defeat Napoleon soon, but think of the future. Why, in 100 years people will still be glad of the Bell Rock Lighthouse. Then, as Mr. Stevenson folded away his plans and drawings, Jamie interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir," he began hesitantly. "Yes?" "Well, I just wanted to say how beautiful your plans look. You must have had a fine education, sir." Mr. Stevenson sensed that there was more to come, and he stooped down to Jamie's height. "Well, you're quite right, Jamie. Education is very important if you want to make a mark in this world." Jamie kept remembering the Dominie's words, mocking and taunting him. "The Bell Rock work won't last forever, Jamie Scott. Why, you can't even write your name." And now, here was Mr. Stevenson explaining to the workmen about the last jobs to be done on the tower. Suddenly, time was running out for Jamie and the work which fed his family. "I would like to read and write too," he said. Mr. Stevenson smiled and looked at him closely. "One day, I'll see that you do," he promised. And outside, the storms howled and smashed against the barrack house. Chapter 11. The Return. In August, the very last stone was landed from the Smeaton onto the rock, with a great cheer from all the workmen. They had done it! They had completed the stonework before winter came with storms and snow. Mr. Stevenson was obviously very pleased, for he stood smiling from ear to ear. Then all the workmen pushed the bogey to the bottom of the tower, and together they all hoisted it to the very top of the lighthouse, 90 feet above them. Even now it was tricky work, for this last block weighed over a ton, and it was over 7 feet long, but with so many willing hands it was soon slotted into place as the last part of the light room floor. The tower was finished. Of course, there was a lot more work to be done, but the laborious ferrying of stone blocks from Arbroath was over, and the men celebrated with beer and strong pipe tobacco that night in the bunk room. Jamie even played Will You No Come Back Again on the fiddle, for by now he had learned more tunes, and the men listened quietly, even while he played. Soon after, many of the workmen left the barrack house forever, but a new army of craftsmen then arrived as glaziers and plumbers and carpenters came out from Arbroath to complete the lighthouse work. Soon Jamie found himself fetching tins of white paint for the men dangling by ropes and planks from the balcony. That was one job he was glad to have avoided. Then sometimes he was needed by the joiners to bring some tool or hold some joint in place while they fitted out the living quarters inside the tower. And above them, the plumbers and glaziers erected the lamp room with its shiny windows and the copper dome on top. Once he accidentally broke a small pane of glass and received a terrible row from a most irate foreman. "Do you realise how much that glass cost?" he asked, and Jamie shook his head. "Don't you know that a glass blower has to produce a cylinder of molten glass, carefully lay it on a table, then carefully cut off the ends and lay the middle part out flat, then carefully let it all cool into a sheet of window glass? And all just so that you could break it?" The glazier stressed his words sarcastically. Jamie felt ashamed, and the foreman marched off, satisfied that his lecture had worked. But from then on, Jamie left the carrying of glass to others, for he has no wish to anger the fellow again. Then one day, the 2 huge fog bells arrived. Soon, they were also hoisted to the top and fitted into place, and then the crane was dismantled and taken away. It was a sad moment for the workmen who had been there from the start, for it seemed to mark the end of their work on the rock. Even old Archie, who had never done a stroke of work outside the barrack house, seemed sorry to see the familiar crane which had lifted so many thousands of stone blocks into place finally leave the bell rock. Soon after, the furniture for the lightkeepers was delivered, and there was a lot of struggling to get everything up to the doorway and then round the twisting stair to the rooms above. By now, a brass ladder led to the front door, 30 feet above the rock, and even the door itself had been installed. Actually, there were 2 doors. First a heavy timber one, and then inside that a thick brass one with a plate glass window. With a bit of luck, these 2 would be enough to keep out even the worst storms. Inside, the stair led first to a room used for storing drinking water and fuel, then on and up to the lighthouse storeroom, where oil and lamp wicks and spare panes of lamp glass would soon be kept. The 3rd floor was a kitchen, and here the plumbers were still installing a pump for sucking water up from the bottom room. This would save the keepers from having to run up and down stairs to fetch their water. Beyond the kitchen was the bedroom, where carpenters were busy fitting up the keepers' bunks. By now, the lighthouse was much narrower, and inside, the room was only 10 feet wide, so they were building the bunks 3 high, with spaces between for a clothes press or cupboard for each lighthouse keeper. The 5th floor was being fitted with bookshelves and a beautiful round table with feet carved like dolphins. This would soon become a library, where the keepers would be able to read during their lonely hours. Then the stairway spiralled up to the lamp room itself, but for the moment it was still empty, for the light had not yet arrived. Eventually, the fitting out was finished, and most of the craftsmen left the rock. Only a few men remained, and the bunk room had a rather deserted feel about it. Jamie would look around and remember who used to sleep in which bunk, and whose initials these were carved into that beam. Old Archie was still there, of course, for he was too wily to have been sent away yet. And there were a few others, but Big Tam was gone, with his great anvil and box of embers, and even the cook was away, so that old Archie had to do most of the cooking. Then, one day, the light was delivered. The crate was carefully lifted up to the front door by Mr. Stevenson himself, and then carried up to the light room. Mr. Stevenson spent most of that day with 2 workmen busy connecting up the lamp, and it was not until the late afternoon that he reappeared with a contented look on his face. "Well, it seems we shall be able to light up soon," he told the bunkhouse men. "We must first advertise the new light in the newspapers, so that seamen will know what to expect when they sail along this part of the coast, and then we shall light the lamp." He rubbed his hands together with pleasure at the thought of completing such a long and difficult task. "May I see the lamp before it is lit?" asked Jamie, and Mr. Stevenson beamed. "Why, of course, Jamie. Come with me now, before evening falls." And the 2 of them set off across the walkway and up the winding lighthouse stair to the top. And there stood the light, beautiful and shining and magnificent. There were 4 brass oil lamps, each fitted with a shiny reflector shaped like a saucer and placed behind the glass chimney. These 4 lamps were arranged back to back so that they pointed in 4 directions, while the reflectors would greatly increase the brightness of each lamp. That way, sailors would see the light from any direction, whereas other lighthouses had mostly 1 lamp which could only be seen from one direction. In addition to the reflectors, which were placed behind the lights, 2 of the lamps had a pane of red glass in front, so that when the whole apparatus revolved, sailors would see a white and then a red light passing alternately. This would tell them that it must be the Bell Rock, for no other lighthouse had the same red and white flashes. Finally, the whole lamp was made to turn by a mechanism driven by heavy dangling weights, rather like those in a grandfather clock. Jamie was very impressed. "But it's all so shiny," he exclaimed, and Mr. Stevenson laughed. "Well, I hope so. I hope that this light will be seen 30 miles away when the weather is clear." 30 miles, Jamie gasped. "Why, that's much further than Arbroath. Does it mean that my family will be able to watch the light?" "Of course, but only if the keepers keep these reflectors clean. I shall have to inspect this place from time to time to be sure that they are cleaning and polishing to my satisfaction. If not, I shall tell them that your mother has told me that she cannot see the lights shining brightly." 2 weeks later, the 3 lighthouse keepers arrived, resplendent in blue jackets. They seemed to find the lighthouse very comfortable, and soon a spiral of smoke rose from the tower as they lit a fire and prepared their first meal. For a time, Mr. Stevenson went to instruct them in their duties, but then, at last, the day came when the lamp would be lit. "Well then, it seems that this will be your last day on the Bell Rock," said Mr. Stevenson to Jamie. "If everything works well tonight, we shall dismantle the barrack house, and soon only the lighthouse tower will mark this place." Old Archie, however, did not seem to be listening, for he was watching a strange vessel dropping anchor outside. "It seems you've visitors, Mr. Stevenson," he said through that straggly beard of his. "Seems to be the Navy." Everyone went to the window and saw a Royal Navy sloop anchored at a short distance offshore. A longboat was pulling towards them, and when it grounded at the landing place, a young officer sprang out and marched smartly to the barrack house. Mr. Stevenson went down to meet him, while the others listened intently from the doorway. "Good afternoon, sir," the young officer said. "Captain Smith sent his compliments." "Thank you, Lieutenant, and tell him I return the compliment. But why do we have the honour of a visit from His Majesty's Navy?" "Captain Smith says to advise you that severe storms to the south have driven a number of French warships towards Scotland. He says at least 3 have been blown to the north, and he asks that you should not illuminate your lighthouse tonight. Then perhaps they may have no mark from which to sail south again. But everything is ready. I must light up tonight. I must. Why, men have toiled for years on this wretched rock for this day. I am sorry, sir. but Captain Smith has Admiralty orders forbidding you to light the lamps until these French warships have been chased off." "Very well, Lieutenant," said Mr. Stevenson stiffly. "Tell Captain Smith that I shall oblige him, but for one night only." "Thank you, sir. I am sure that would suit the captain very well." The officer turned smartly and went back to the waiting longboat. "Damned French," muttered Mr. Stevenson crossly as he climbed back into the barrack house. Well, of course, there was great excitement on the rock as evening fell. The lighthouse keepers were constantly up in the light room, scanning the horizon for a sign of the French, and with every report of nothing to be seen, Mr. Stevenson became more and more impatient. Finally, night fell, and the beautiful shiny lamp was left unlit. Even the barrack house window shutters were closed, and Mr. Stevenson went down onto the rock to be sure that not a light could be seen from the Bell Rock. Outside, the wind began to rise, and soon Jamie could hear spray dashing against the walls. "Well, if the French are nearby, they won't enjoy a North Sea storm," said old Archie. "They won't come back here in a hurry." No one could sleep that night. But was it the howling wind, or thinking of the French, that kept Jamie awake for all those hours? Then, ages later, Mr. Stevenson's head looked down from the trapdoor. "I do believe I can see a vessel," he exclaimed, and an excited chatter broke out in the bunkroom. "It's very dark outside and there's spray everywhere, but I have been watching with my telescope, and I'm sure I saw a shape out to sea." At that very moment, there was the most almighty crashing sound right beside the barrack house. There was no mistaking it. Something was actually smashing up on the Bell Rock itself. Jamie could clearly hear the sound of timbers groaning and splitting, even above the racket of the storm. Then there were a number of loud bangs, perhaps masts falling, and even voices. "Mon Dieu, au secours, sauvez-nous!" They could hear them clearly now, and the voices were French. One of the enemy warships must have run onto the Bell Rock because there was no light. The trick had worked. There was the most excited shouting you can imagine in the bunkroom. What were they going to do now? Were they likely to be attacked? Were they safe up in the barrack house? Then Mr. Stevenson's head reappeared at the top door. "You must not open your shutters. Don't give the game away. But you should see what's going on outside. It's a French warship, right enough, but she's breaking up. I doubt she'll last an hour in this storm." He seemed very pleased at this. "That will teach Bonaparte to start a war with Britain." "But we can't just leave them out there," said Jamie suddenly. "There might be survivors, men hanging onto the rocks." Mr. Stevenson pursed his lips for a moment. You could see how he felt about the French, but his conscience troubled him. "You're right, Jamie," he said. "If we are Christians, we must help them." Jamie smiled and ran to find his jacket. "Here, you'll need these," said old Archie, holding out some burning torches from the fire. So they took them and set off down the ladder to the rock. Rab was barking furiously, and, just as Jamie left, old Archie called to take the dog with him. "If anyone gives you trouble, just call for Rab. He'll soon deal with it." Jamie tucked the animal under one arm and set off after the others. What a storm was blowing! It was the kind that Jamie had often feared, even when he was safe inside the barrack house. But now he did not even notice the spray whipping into his face and stinging his eyes. He was transfixed by the sight of the wrecked Frenchman. Even in the dim darkness of night, he could see the stricken vessel lying crazily on her side. As he ran towards the wreck, he could see the shattered masts and torn sails now shrieking eerily in the gale and smacking every so often with a noise like pistol shots. Huge waves were already pounding the hull, and great splits and gashes ran all along the near side. Every fresh roller seemed to charge into the wreck like a white frothing bull, sending it lurching and reeling further to its grave. And all this time, voices moaned above the din of the rushing sea, "Au secours! Au secours!" And Rab ran back and forth along the water's edge, barking and barking. It was an impossible mission of mercy. Already, the others had vanished into the night to search for survivors, and Jamie was alone. Spray lashed into his face, making a mockery of the jacket he wore for warmth. Solid dark water swirled round his legs, tugging at him menacingly like a devil at his coat-tails. Seaweed and rocky pools tricked him at every step as he slithered desperately in the night along the rocks, calling out into the storm. "Is anyone there? Call if you hear me! Call out!" he shouted till he was hoarse. But it was useless in such a gale. Then suddenly he heard it. A feeble cry through the shrilling wind. "Help! Help!" Jamie's heart leapt. Someone was calling in English. Someone was still alive in that inferno of swirling seas and spray. He shouted for the others, but his voice must have been lost in the storm, for no one came. He would have to search by himself. Then he heard the feeble cry again, "Help! Over here!" And he ran to the shore, not 10 yards away. "Help!" Now the voice was right beside him. Jamie crouched down with his burning torch, and there in the blustering light were 2 bodies, one lying half on top of the other, clinging limply to a shattered wooden spar. Jamie's heart was beating away like mad now, but he caught hold of some clothing and started dragging towards the rocks. It was difficult to pull with just one hand, for the man's clothes were so waterlogged, but he dare not lose his torch. And all the time he kept shouting for help. He could see flickering torches moving around further off, but no one came. Then suddenly Rab appeared and caught hold of a sleeve, and together they dragged the man through the water. At last Jamie reached a safer place and pulled the limp body beyond the sea. Then he struggled back for the other man and pulled him ashore too, digging his feet into rocky fissures when the sea swirled out, dragging for all he was worth when the sea rushed in again and offered some help. Then at last Mr. Stevenson and some others appeared. "Help me!" cried Jamie with the last of his strength. "Help me get him ashore!" And strong arms lifted the man the last few yards to safety. "Are they still alive?" asked Jamie, fighting for breath but desperate to know. He was calling in English. "This one's dead," said someone. Jamie crawled over to the body and lifted his torch. The man was lying on his face, but even in the firelight, Jamie saw a mark on the cheek, and he pulled the body over. It was Scarface. "This one's still alive!" came another urgent cry, and Jamie scrambled over the rocks and seaweed to the second man. A great burly body with wild, straggly hair. Jamie had seen that humpy shape before. Desperately, he dragged the man over and held his torch close to the face. It was his father, still alive. "Get him into the bunkhouse with the others," shouted Mr. Stevenson above the storm. So there were more rescued in that storm. Then, taking a limb each, 4 men stumbled and slithered to the ladder while Jamie held the light and wept unashamedly. Jamie sat all night by the bunk where they put his father. The face was pale and he looked so weak, but he was alive. It was like a miracle. Then sometime during the morning, the great barrel chest stirred and the man blinked in the light. Then he saw his son. "Jamie?" he asked feebly. "Is that you? Where am I? Am I alive or dreaming?" Jamie smiled happily, for there was no disguising that rasping voice. "It's me, father. You're safe. And am I in Scotland?" "Aye. Would you like some of Archie's fine warm porridge?" But just then, Mr. Stevenson came down from his room. "Well, how is everyone? Are Boney's boys behaving themselves?" Jamie looked round and for the first time noticed more huddled bodies slumped on the bunks. There seemed to be quite a few. No wonder he had been alone in the battle to save his father, for the others must have been struggling with survivors all over the Bell Rock. "Are we safe with all these Frenchies here?" he asked old Archie in a slightly worried voice. "Oh, they're British. Your father wasn't the only one to escape, you know," old Archie grinned. "The Frenchies are all in the cook's room, but don't you worry. They're a sorry-looking bunch, I can tell you. Only half-dressed, most of them. Must have been asleep when they ran aground." Old Archie puffed away in his pipe for a moment with a wee smile. "Aye, they may be fine French seamen, but it's wonderful how a long drink of North Sea briny can fair dampen a man's spirits. They'll be quiet as lambs. You'll see." "Well now, Mr. Scott, you're a lucky man," said Mr. Stevenson. "A survivor. Indeed, there's not even a sign of the wreck now. Must have disappeared in the storm." "Where's Tom Bright?" said Jamie's father. "He saved me. I'd never have made it, but he kept holding me up out of the water." "Tom is dead," said Mr. Stevenson. "But we have his body, and he'll have a proper Christian burial." And Jamie's father looked so sad. Then later he told his tale of how he had been captured when the French sank his ship and then left to rot with others from the crew in a dungeon somewhere in Holland. One day Tom Bright joined him after leaving the Smeaton, taken prisoner by a frigate off Denmark, and they had become friends in that damp and stinking place. Then just a few days ago, they had all been taken onto a warship. There were quite a few Scots among them, mostly press-ganged like himself, but he didn't know what they were being moved for. One man said it was to work in France, but no one really knew, and on the way they had run into a dreadful storm. It had been a terror for the prisoners, locked up with the rats somewhere down in the bowels of the hull. But then the vessel had smashed onto some rocks, and a great hole had opened up right in front of him. He saw several men disappear before huge waves sucked him out too, but then he swallowed so much seawater that he had little recollection, only of Tom Bright's strong arms keeping him afloat. Mr. Stevenson smiled. "Some of your shipmates are here too. 4 at least, to judge from their clothes." And Jamie's father sank back into the bunk, smiling. Later that day, the Smeaton arrived at the Rock, and under armed escort, a group of bedraggled French seamen wrapped in blankets were taken away. Then they all prepared to leave. Jamie, his father, old Archie, Rab the dog, and the others who were to take the longboat out to the waiting sloop. They were watched only by the blue-jacketed keepers from the lighthouse balcony, and Mr. Stevenson standing alone on the Rock to see them off. Jamie turned to the barrack house for the last time, for he knew he would never see it again. "Thank you," he said to Mr. Stevenson. Even if his words could not be heard from that distance, he had to say them all the same. Then he stepped into the boat, and they pushed away from the Rock. Soon they reached Arbroath, and Jamie's father wept a little when he caught sight of the ruined abbey on the hill above. Evening was falling, and a long shaft of sinking red sunlight danced on the ruins for a moment before disappearing. There was quite a crowd on the quayside as the Smeaton glided in, but it was mostly to watch the sullen French sailors being led off into captivity. Then they all went ashore, and on the harbour wall Jamie's father suddenly turned and embraced his son. "Look!" shouted old Archie. "Look!" And at that moment a bright light blazed out of the evening gloom far out to sea. The people on the quay gave a great cheer for the Bell Rock that echoed all around the ruined abbey and into the dusk. "Come on!" cried Jack Lamont. "Time for a celebration drink." "No thanks," said Jamie's father. "It's been 3 years since I even smelled strong ale." Now I couldn't take a drop. So Jamie and his father went on alone, up through the streets and alleys to their little house, with its 2 rooms and warm fireside and tears and kisses.